From Henry VIII's extravagant banquets to humble peasant meals, dining in Tudor England wasn't just about eating, it was performance art with gravy. Picture this. It's the 16th century, the reign of Henry VIII. You walk into the Great Hall of a Tudor palace, and the first thing you notice isn't the food, it's the sheer theatre of it all. Banquets were less about filling stomachs and more about flexing power. A noble table wasn't just furniture, it was a stage, and the actors were dressed in velvet sleeves with greasy hands. The king at the head of the feast wasn't just a monarch, he was the producer, director and star of the show, with food as his special effects. Hello travellers! Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you're listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. For the wealthy, dining wasn't a quick affair. Meals could last for hours, sometimes stretching across an entire day. Nobles would cycle through courses, but don't imagine a tidy 3-course dinner like today. A Tudor course might contain 30 dishes at once, each one paraded in with pomp and ceremony. The goal wasn't to finish them, no one could eat that much, but to show everyone that you could afford that much. It was conspicuous consumption with goose grease on top. And yes, people would eat themselves sick, then politely excuse themselves to make room for more. Imagine the medieval version of a Las Vegas buffet, except the shrimp cocktails are peacocks in full feather regalia. Of course, not everyone was eating like a king. In fact, almost no one was. For the average Tudor peasant, dining looked more like survival. While nobles sat beneath tapestries chewing through entire stags, peasants crouched by the hearth with a wooden bowl of pottage. Pottage was a sort of everything stew, grains, cabbage, maybe a root vegetable if you were lucky, and on a very good day, a sliver of salted pork that was more fat than meat. Think of it as the Tudor equivalent of mystery soup from your college cafeteria, but with fewer food safety regulations. And here's the kicker. Peasants often ate this same dish every day, twice a day for their entire lives. Breakfast, pottage. Dinner, pottage. The good news? You didn't have to think about meal prep. The bad news? Your taste buds gave up the will to live by age 7. One of the strangest quirks of Tudor dining was how political it was. Your seat at the table mattered just as much as what was on it. At a noble feast where you sat told the world where you ranked in society. The closer you were to the monarch or host, the better the food you received. Sit at the far end, and by the time the trenchers came to you, the venison was gone, and all that was left was something unidentifiable in sauce. So dinner wasn't just dinner, it was a ladder of ambition, where the bread crust you got literally measured your status. Forget office politics. Tudor table politics were far more brutal. Banquets were noisy, smelly, chaotic spectacles. Imagine a room filled with the heat of roasting fires, servants carrying platters the size of bathtubs, dogs lurking underfoot waiting for scraps, minstrels striking up bawdy tunes, and drunken lords bellowing at each other. The air smelled like a combination of roasting meat, spilled ale, and at least one unfortunate person who hadn't bathed since Easter. And if you were in the King's Hall, expect entertainment between courses. Jugglers, musicians, even acrobats performed while people gnawed on swan legs. Eating and entertainment were inseparable. Netflix and dinner, Tudor edition. For nobles, food was a way of saying, "Look at me, I'm rich, important, and definitely not starving." Peacocks were roasted, then redressed in their feathers just to be carried to the table in full plume. Elaborate sugar sculptures decorated the feast, moulded into castles, animals, or biblical scenes. These weren't meant to be eaten, they were edible bragging rights. If Instagram had existed, nobles would have posted their sugar pagodas with captions like "Blessed Peacock Life." Meanwhile, peasants had no stage to perform on. Their meals were practical, fuel to get through a day of back-breaking labour. No one applauded when a bowl of cabbage stew hit the table. The only spectacle was whether you'd managed to stop the dog from stealing it. This massive divide between peasant and noble dining defines Tudor food culture. To eat well was to declare your power, while to eat poorly was simply reality. But both sides of the table shared one thing. Meals were communal. Food was rarely a solitary act. Even the poorest families gathered around one pot, dipping bread or wooden spoons into the same dish. Eating was social, noisy, and messy. And let's be honest, forks weren't widely in use yet. So yes, everything was eaten with knives, spoons, or fingers. Your sleeve was your napkin, and your manners were optional. For Tudors, hygiene wasn't on the menu. So welcome to Tudor dining, a world where food wasn't just sustenance but spectacle, where the gap between rich and poor was as wide as the king's waistband, and where gravy might be considered an art form. Whether you were chewing on venison at a noble's table or choking down cabbage stew by the fire, one thing was certain: meals in Tudor England were never boring. In this world, food wasn't just eaten, it was lived. The finest man-shaped bread was reserved for nobles, while peasants chewed on rough rye and maslin. Your bread loaf wasn't just food, it was your LinkedIn profile. If you want to understand Tudor society, don't look at the portraits, the castles, or the feathered hats. Look at the bread. Nothing captured social hierarchy more clearly than what sat on the table in loaf form. Bread wasn't just a carbohydrate, it was a ranking system baked fresh daily. Let's start at the top of the loaf hierarchy, man-shaped bread. This was the Tudor equivalent of artisanal sourdough from an overpriced bakery, except instead of influencers posting about it, it was dukes and duchesses showing off to their dinner guests. Man-shaped was made from finely sieved wheat flour, pure white and fluffy compared to the coarse breads of the poor. The catch? Getting flour that white required extra milling and sieving, expensive processes that wasted grain and demanded more labour, so only the wealthy could afford it. Eating man-shaped bread was basically eating money in gluten form. Nobles didn't just nibble it for taste, they displayed it like edible jewellery. Guests knew instantly, this house is loaded, pass the butter, and no, there wasn't a bakery chain on every Tudor street corner. Bread for the elite was often baked right in noble households by servants, sometimes even in private bread ovens. The ultimate flex? Having an in-house baker who produced soft white loaves while your tenants outside the walls were gnawing on bark like rye. Now let's step down the ladder. The further you moved from nobility, the darker and rougher your bread became. Peasants and labourers ate what they could get: rye, barley and maslin loaves. Maslin, in case you haven't had the misfortune, was a bread made from a mix of wheat and rye. And when I say mix, don't think of a fancy artisanal blend. This was a gritty, chewy compromise that said we can't afford wheat, so let's dilute it and pray nobody notices. These loaves were heavy, dense, and lasted longer than your average Tudor peasant's teeth. Eating maslin wasn't an act of pleasure, it was survival. One slice could probably double as a doorstop. In fact, there's a decent chance peasants were eating bread so rough it included bits of stone from the mill, which would grind down your molars faster than sugar ever could. Humour aside, bread really was the staff of life. Grain was the backbone of the Tudor diet, especially for the poor. Where nobles filled their bellies with meat and exotic delicacies, the average farmer relied on bread to make up the majority of daily calories. If the harvest failed, famine was just around the corner, and bread, or the lack of it, became a life or death matter. Here's the funny part: today we chase whole grain bread like it's health gold. Supermarkets charge extra for loaves with seeds, oats and brown flecks. But in Tudor England, the darker your bread, the lower your status. Brown bread wasn't rustic chic, it was poverty on a plate. The irony is almost painful. If you served a Tudor noble a slice of modern multi-grain bread, they'd think you were trying to assassinate them. For them, the whiter the bread, the better. It wasn't just about flavour, it was about proving you could waste resources to get flour as pale as snow. In other words, the more you refined your grain, the less refined your dinner conversation had to be. Bread also had a practical role beyond eating. It was currency. Wages for labourers were sometimes paid partly in bread or grain. Rations were measured in loaves, and households counted their prosperity by how much bread they could dole out. Even monasteries and almshouses gave out bread as charity to the poor, often of the roughest kind. And then there were trenchers, flat rounds of stale bread that doubled as plates. Nobles might start their feast with food piled on trenchers, which would then be discarded, given to servants or handed to the poor. In theory, this was charitable. In practice, the poor were stuck eating greasy bread that had just doubled as someone else's dinnerware. Nothing says generosity like second-hand gravy. Bread wasn't only practical, it was symbolic. Religious feasts and fasts revolved around bread. It was central to Christian liturgy in the form of communion wafers. At the family table, bread held almost sacred meaning. It was blessed, it was shared, it was the anchor of every meal. To go without bread was to go without life. For peasants, offering bread to a guest was the highest form of hospitality. For nobles, presenting a manchet loaf was a way of saying, "I have money, power, and you should admire me while you chew this delicate fluff." So, when we say bread was status in Tudor England, we mean it literally. Bread revealed everything: wealth, power, health, even piety. The texture, the colour, the weight, it all spoke volumes before you even took a bite. A Tudor's daily bread wasn't just nourishment, it was a social announcement. Holding a soft white manchet loaf said, "I dine with dukes." Clutching a rye hunk said, "I'll be lucky if I survive winter." And chewing on maslin, well, that said, "My LinkedIn profile is still under construction." Bread in Tudor England was far more than a food. It was a language. It told the story of inequality, wealth, survival and pride. Today we might argue over sourdough starters and gluten-free options, but for Tudors, the bread on your table was your resume, your credit score, and your class identity, all rolled into one. So next time you bite into a baguette or pick up a wholemeal loaf, remember, in the Tudor world, that single slice could decide whether you were a king, a commoner, or just someone holding the soggy trencher from yesterday's feast. Since water often carried disease, ale became the everyday drink for everyone, including children. Tudor kids didn't drink juice boxes, they had breakfast beer. If you wanted to stay alive in Tudor England, you didn't trust the water. Water was unpredictable. Sure, it looked clear when it trickled from a stream, but give it a few hours of sitting in a wooden bucket, and it could turn into a bacterial cocktail with the same effect as drinking pond scum, unless you lived by a pristine spring, which was rare. Your fresh water source was usually shared with animals, laundry, and every neighbour upstream who decided to dump waste where they pleased. So what was the solution? Aloe. Not because everyone wanted to live in a permanent happy hour, but because aloe was boiled during brewing, killing off many of the nasties lurking in water. It was liquid life insurance with a frothy head on top. Let's make something clear. The ale Tudors drank most of the time wasn't the boozy knock-you-flat pint you might imagine. Small ale was the daily drink, low in alcohol, often only 1–2% strength. It was hydrating, safe, and filled with calories, making it as essential as bread. Think of it less like a party beverage and more like a medieval Gatorade. This meant ale was for everyone. Men, women, and yes, even children. Imagine a modern school lunchroom. Except instead of milk cartons, every kid has a tankard of weak ale sloshing onto their trenchers. Breakfast, ale, midday, ale, dinner, more ale. A Tudor's body was about 60% water and maybe 20% ale at all times. Here's a surprising twist. The early Tudor ale industry was dominated by women, known as alewives. Brewing ale was part of household management, just like baking bread. Women brewed for their families and often sold extra batches to neighbours or local taverns. You could spot an alewife's house by the ale stake, a wooden pole or garland hung outside the door, like a medieval neon sign saying "beer here." Of course, with alcohol comes judgment. Alewives were often accused of watering down their product, shortchanging customers or serving sour ale, till they became the butt of jokes. And suspiciously enough, some of the imagery of alewives, pointy hats, cauldrons, cats by the hearth, crept into later stereotypes of witches. In other words, Tudor society both relied on women's brewing and simultaneously mocked them for it. Some things never change. For much of the early Tudor period, ale was the go-to, but by the 15th and 16th centuries, another drink was rising in popularity: beer. The difference? Hops. Ale was unhopped, giving it a sweet, malty flavour. Beer, imported from the Low Countries, used hops which made it last longer and gave it that bitter edge. At first, many English drinkers resisted hops. They thought beer tasted strange, even dangerous. Parliament tried to ban hops at various points, with claims that they were a wicked weed, but as imports grew and brewing technology advanced, beer became increasingly common in Tudor taverns. By the late 16th century, beer was overtaking traditional ale in popularity. So, while nobles and travellers started sipping hopped beer, peasants stuck mostly to their beloved ale. Ale versus beer wasn't just a taste preference, it was a cultural divide. Drinking ale wasn't confined to the home. Taverns, inns, and alehouses were central to Tudor social life. Taverns sold wine, inns offered lodging and ale, and alehouses were essentially the Tudor version of your local pub. Alehouses were noisy, smoky, and often cramped. Picture wooden benches, A hearth fire, dogs underfoot, dice games in the corner, and tankards slamming on tables. They weren't just places to drink, they were centres of gossip, business deals, and occasionally brawls. If you wanted to know the latest news or hear the latest slander, you didn't check a newspaper, you went to the alehouse. Authorities worried about this. Alehouses became so popular that Tudor governments tried repeatedly to regulate them, fearing that idle drinking led to idleness, crime and rebellion. Laws were passed limiting their number, restricting their opening hours, and even setting prices for ale. Spoiler, none of it worked. The alehouse remained the beating heart of Tudor communal life. Ale wasn't just about hydration, it was also fuel. A labourer working dawn to dusk needed thousands of calories a day, and ale delivered some of that in liquid form. Rich in carbohydrates, it provided a steady trickle of energy to get through long hours in the field. This is one reason Tudors could drink so much. Records suggest labourers might consume 3 to 4 quarts a day, sometimes more. Before you picture staggering peasants, remember, most of this was small ale, barely alcoholic. It quenched thirst and kept them upright. Stronger ale and beer were saved for special occasions or wealthier households. Was ale healthier than water? For the Tudors, absolutely. But it wasn't perfect. Brewing wasn't a sterile process, and batches could easily go sour. Some ale was so foul that customers complained loudly or tried to avoid paying. Laws required ale tasters. Yes, that was a real job, to check the quality of local brews. If your ale was declared unfit for man's body, you could be fined. Still, given the choice between dodgy water or dodgy ale, most Tudors chose ale. At least with ale, the worst outcome was a hangover, not dysentery. Ale wasn't just a drink in Tudor England, it was the foundation of daily life. It was safer than water, provided energy, and fueled both labour and leisure. It sustained peasants in the fields, filled noble cellars, and kept children hydrated in the absence of clean alternatives. So, while today we might raise a pint for fun, a Tudor raised a tankard for survival. And if you were a Tudor child sipping your breakfast beer before heading out to chase chickens or chop firewood, you weren't being rebellious, you were just staying hydrated. In other words, Tudor England ran on ale the way we run on coffee. Except, let's be honest, ale sounds a lot more fun at 8 a.m. Wealthy diets overflowed with beef, mutton, pork and venison. A Tudor noble's diet was basically a petting zoo on a plate. If you really wanted to measure Tudor wealth, don't bother looking at castles, jewels or the number of tapestries someone owned. Just peek at their dinner table. Because in Tudor England, nothing screamed status louder than sheer, overwhelming meat consumption. Nobles devoured animal flesh with the enthusiasm of a modern teenager left alone at an all-you-can-eat barbecue buffet. Let's start with Henry VIII, the king who made overeating a lifestyle brand. Household accounts show that his court consumed staggering amounts of meat, tons of beef, pork, mutton and venison each year, along with more exotic fare like swans, cranes and even porpoises. That's right, porpoises. If it swam, flew or walked, there was a decent chance it ended up on a Tudor table, roasted and dripping with gravy. The nobility treated meat not just as food but as proof of power. Having a haunch of venison on your table didn't just mean dinner, it meant you had access to royal hunting parks, the land, the game and the privilege. Owning meat meant you were plugged into the right networks with connections as juicy as the roast itself, and they didn't nibble politely. Wealthy Tudors ate in shocking quantities. At a grand feast, a nobleman could work through beef, mutton, pork, poultry and fish all in one sitting. Imagine Thanksgiving dinner, except 7 times a week with extra swan for garnish. Not all meats were created equal. Venison was the crown jewel, reserved for the elite who had the right to hunt in royal forests. Eating venison was like flashing a VIP pass, exclusive, prestigious and unavailable to common folk. Beef and mutton came next, hearty staples for the rich. Pork was popular too, often turned into sausages or salted to last longer. For poultry, chickens and geese were everyday birds, but turkeys made a splash in the later Tudor period after being imported from the New World. Suddenly, you could impress your guests with a bird they had never seen before, the Tudor equivalent of serving sushi in 1580. And then there were the display meats, animals roasted more for spectacle than flavour, peacocks roasted and then redressed in their feathers, boars' heads decorated with fruit in their mouths, exotic animals hunted more for bragging rights than nutrition. Basically, Nobles turned their feasts into zoological exhibitions, half dinner, half circus. While nobles gorged themselves on endless roasts, the average Tudor peasant might only eat meat occasionally, holidays, festivals, or rare windfalls. For them, meat wasn't fuel but luxury. A salted scrap of pork or a bone for broth could transform an otherwise dreary pot of grain into a special meal. The gap between noble and peasant plates couldn't have been starker. Nobles worried about indigestion from too much venison, while peasants worried whether they'd taste pork again before Christmas. In this way, meat didn't just fill stomachs, it reinforced class divides. Of course, meat spoils quickly, and before refrigeration, Tudor households had to rely on salting, smoking, and pickling to stretch their animal abundance. This worked, but at a cost. Salted beef could be so tough you practically needed a chisel to chew it. Smoked pork lasted longer, but carried an intense flavour that might overpower the stew. For the wealthy, preservation was a fallback. Fresh was always preferred because fresh meant access to land, labour, and resources. But even nobles salted barrels of beef to provision their households through lean months. Tudor doctors loved to weigh in on diet, often with bizarre conclusions. They believed meat carried different humours. Beef was thought to be strengthening but heavy. Mutton was gentle and good for digestion. Pork was rich and indulgent. And venison was drying. Yes, drying. Imagine being told your dinner is a piece of desert in disguise. Physicians often warned against eating too much red meat, but let's be honest, nobles weren't listening. When your chef brings in a whole roasted deer stuffed with birds, you don't say sorry doctor's orders, you dig in. Meat wasn't just sustenance, it was political. Serving roasted beef at a feast showed you had cattle and fields to support them. Offering venison showed royal favour. Presenting swan or porpoise proved exotic connections. Every cut of meat carried symbolism. The nobility used meat the way we use designer brands today, as identity. A guest at your table might not remember your witty conversation, but they'd remember the peacock stuffed with larks. Dinner was branding, and meat was the logo. While meat symbolized wealth, it also brought problems. Overeating rich, fatty foods led to gout, indigestion, and general stomach misery. Henry VIII himself suffered heavily from these issues, his love of meat contributing to his legendary size and declining health. Tudor nobles might have had endless access to roasts, but they also had endless nights of clutching their stomachs in regret. And then there was waste. When 30 dishes were served at once, not everything got eaten. Leftovers might trickle down to servants, but plenty was discarded. Meanwhile, outside the manor walls, families were scraping together barley bread and cabbage soup. Tudor society had no shame about showing the gap between plates. In Tudor England, meat wasn't just dinner, it was destiny. Nobles turned their dining halls into petting zoos, turned buffets, while peasants dreamed of the rare scrap of bacon. Every roast was a symbol, every stew a statement, and every animal consumed another reminder that in Tudor society, your plate reflected your place. So yes, a Tudor noble's diet really was a petting zoo on a plate. And if you were lucky enough to be invited, you'd better bring an appetite or at least a strong stomach, because in this world, feasting was politics, indulgence, and theatre all rolled into one and stuffed into a boar's head for decoration. Religious fasting laws forced endless fish meals, even when they tasted atrocious. Imagine Lent that never ends, and every Friday smells like low tide. In Tudor England, the calendar didn't just tell you the date, it told you what was on your plate, and all too often, that plate reeked of fish. Not because people particularly liked it, but because the church demanded it. Catholic fasting rules required abstaining from meat on Fridays, Saturdays, Lent, Advent, and numerous saints' days. When you add all that up, nearly half the year was a no-meat zone. For nobles and peasants alike, that meant swapping roast beef for cod, herring, or whatever aquatic creature could be dredged up. It wasn't exactly a choice. It was law, culture, and salvation rolled into one smelly meal plan. Why fish? The church considered fish acceptable because it came from water, and therefore didn't count as meat. Land animals were thought to inflame lust and gluttony, while fish was supposedly humbler, gentler, and more appropriate for spiritual reflection. In reality, fish wasn't so much holy as it was tolerable. Of course, Tudors didn't see fish as some noble symbol of piety. They saw it as a recurring nuisance. Imagine living in a society where nearly every Friday is fish stick day. except without freezers, tartar sauce, or the option to say, "Can I just have pizza instead?" Herring was the backbone of England's fish supply. Caught in massive shoals off the coast, salted and packed into barrels, it was cheap, plentiful, and deeply unglamorous. For poorer families, herring was often the default fasting food. By the time it travelled inland from the coasts, it was so salty it made you thirstier than before you ate it, and so tough you might have mistaken it for jerky. But herring was reliable. It didn't matter if you liked it. What mattered was that it kept you on the right side of God and the law. So families chewed through herring the way modern kids endure plain oatmeal, not out of joy but obligation. Nobles had more options. Their kitchens turned out sturgeon, salmon, trout and eels. Eels in particular became so popular that river fisheries nearly collapsed from overfishing. The Thames, once teeming with them, became the Tudor equivalent of a fast food drive-through. Every noble demanded eel pie on fasting days. But even nobility struggled with the monotony. When half the year bans meat, even the fanciest sturgeon loses its sparkle. So cooks resorted to disguises. Fish made to look like roasted venison. Eels baked in pies and sauces so heavily spiced you could barely tell what you were eating. For those with money, imports offered variety. Dried cod from Iceland, stockfish from Norway, salted sturgeon from the Baltic. England's ports smelled like a fishmonger's nightmare. Imported fish was expensive and often of questionable freshness by the time it reached the table. Imagine paying a fortune for something that tastes like your attic after a rainstorm. But for Tudor elites, price mattered more than flavour. Serving imported fish showed wealth and global connections, even if it made the room smell like Poseidon's laundry basket. Lent was the true test of Tudor fish endurance. 40 days of no meat, every year, meant 40 days of increasingly desperate fish dishes. For peasants, it was the same herring on repeat, like living in a bad radio station loop. For nobles, cooks had to summon creativity, producing elaborate fish feasts, roasted lampreys, almond milk fish stews, eel pasties, and endless variations of cod. Lampreys deserve a special mention. They look like eels but with circular toothy mouths, basically nightmare fuel that somehow ended up on royal menus. King Henry I, a few centuries earlier, supposedly died from eating too many lampreys. Tudors, however, soldiered on, proving that in the right sauce, even sea monsters could be dinner. Here's where it gets even stranger. Tudor monarchs used fish laws to influence the economy. Henry VIII, and later Elizabeth I, reinforced fish days, not only for religion, but also to support England's fishing industry. By forcing people to eat fish, the Crown kept fishermen employed, shipbuilding alive, and naval power ready. So, when you bit into a salt cod stew, you weren't just following religious law, you were fueling England's imperial ambitions. It was patriotism in pickled form. For the average Tudor, fish days weren't about politics, they were about endurance. Imagine a labourer finishing 12 hours in the fields, hoping for a bit of bacon, only to get yet another slab of salt herring. For many, fasting wasn't a spiritual challenge, it was a stomachache waiting to happen. And yet, breaking the rules wasn't an option. The church loomed over your table, fork in hand. Children grew up associating holy days, not with candles or hymns, but with the smell of fish clinging to their clothes. You could almost chart a Tudor childhood in herringbones. And here's the kicker. Fish didn't exactly travel well. Barrels leaked, salting failed, storage rotted. Many a Tudor family sat down to fresh fish that was anything but. It's a wonder they didn't pray for the return of meat quicker. At least a bad piece of mutton didn't smell like Poseidon had crawled onto your hearth and died. The weird world of Tudor fish days wasn't about taste. It was about rules, religion and survival. Nobles turned fasting into a culinary puzzle, dressing up eels and lampreys like carnival acts. Peasants soldiered through herring until their tongues puckered, and all of England smelled faintly of brine half the year. So yes, imagine Lent that never ends, and every Friday smells like low tide. For the Tudors, fish wasn't just food. It was law, faith, and the salty price of living in a world where half your calendar smelled suspiciously like the docks. Imported sugar was a prized status symbol, and rotten teeth were its unfortunate badge of honour. The richer you were, the faster your smile fell out. When you think of sugar today, you probably picture it sitting in cheerful bags on supermarket shelves, ready to ruin your dentist's day. But in Tudor England, sugar wasn't just a sweetener, it was a luxury good, an exotic jewel of the kitchen, and a glittering sign of status. To have sugar was to declare wealth, to eat sugar was to show off, and to have teeth blackened and broken by sugar? That was practically the Tudor version of flashing a Rolex. Sugar didn't grow in England. It had to be imported from faraway plantations in the Mediterranean, North Africa, and eventually the New World. That journey across oceans and overland caravans meant sugar was brutally expensive. It wasn't something you sprinkled on porridge, it was something you hoarded in locked jars and pulled out to impress guests. In Tudor kitchens, sugar came in solid loaves or sugar cones, conical blocks that had to be broken up with special tongs called sugar nips. Getting your sugar wasn't as simple as opening a bag, it was an industrial workout. Imagine lifting weights at the gym, except your dumbbell crumbles into a sticky mess the moment you hit it with pliers. Because it was so expensive, sugar was used less for taste and more for display. You didn't just serve sugar, you sculpted it. Tudor banquets featured elaborate sugar subtleties, moulded castles, edible ships, and biblical scenes, all carved out of the sweet stuff. Guests didn't always eat them, but they gawked at them. Sugar was a building material, a party trick, a stage prop. Picture it. You're sitting at a banquet, and instead of a centerpiece bouquet, you've got a sugar fortress complete with knights and banners. It wasn't about does it taste good, it was about does this prove I'm richer than you? Spoiler, yes, but sugar had a hidden side effect. Too much of it and your teeth began to suffer. Dental hygiene in Tudor England was, let's be polite and call it limited. Toothbrushes were primitive, dentistry was horrifying, and cavities had no mercy. Wealthy Tudors who could afford sugar ate it proudly, and their teeth showed it. By the end of the Tudor period, blackened, decayed teeth were almost a mark of status. Commoners joked that if your smile looked like a collapsed timber roof, you must be rich. Poorer folks, ironically, had stronger, healthier teeth, simply because they couldn't afford enough sugar to ruin them. Tudor dentists, when they existed at all, couldn't fix much, so extraction was the only solution. Imagine pulling out your rotting molars without anesthesia, and then going right back to nibbling candied almonds. So yes, the richer you were, the faster your smile fell out. Like many luxury foods, sugar wasn't just for feasts, it was also prescribed by physicians. Tudor doctors, guided by humoral theory, believed sugar could balance the body, cure coughs, soothe stomachs, and even act as an aphrodisiac. Essentially, it was treated as medicine with dessert perks. Recipes for medicinal syrups mixed sugar with herbs, spices, and even vinegar. It was the Tudor version of health supplements, expensive, questionably effective, and marketed with confidence. Did it help? Maybe it made the medicine go down smoother, but mostly, it just ensured your molars filed for early retirement. Sugar was often paired with imported spices to create extravagant dishes. Almonds, candied with sugar, rosewater sweets, ginger confections, or preserved fruits dipped in syrup were common in noble kitchens. These combinations didn't just taste unusual, they screamed wealth. A sugared orange peel wasn't a snack. It was proof that you could buy an orange, import sugar, and afford a cook to waste both in the name of prestige. At banquets, these sugary dishes closed the meal, leaving nobles with sticky fingers and bragging rights. Peasants might finish dinner with a crust of brown bread. Nobles finished with candied cherries flown in from Spain. The contrast couldn't be sharper. Even Tudor children weren't spared from sugar mania, at least the wealthy ones. Noble kids were given candied fruits and sugared almonds, sometimes more as display than genuine affection. Did they bounce off the wooden walls of the Great Hall with energy after eating them? Almost certainly. Imagine a Tudor nursemaid trying to wrangle sugar-drunk children with nothing but a stern glare and a wooden spoon. By the later Tudor era, sugar imports were rising, making it slightly more accessible, but even then, it never lost its air of luxury. The Tudor economy revolved around trade, and sugar was one of its most glittering commodities. The very act of owning sugar meant you were plugged into global commerce, one of the first hints that England was becoming part of a worldwide network of goods, tastes, and eventually colonial exploitation. Behind every sugar cone was a story of labour, conquest, and brutal plantation work, though most Tudors never saw that side. For them, it was simply a sweet miracle that made pies, sauces, and wine taste decadent. Sugar in Tudor England was indulgence, power, and destruction wrapped in one glittering package. It decorated banquet halls, sweetened medicines, and turned noble smiles into dental horror shows. To taste sugar was to taste wealth. To lose your teeth to it was practically a badge of honour. So the next time you stir sugar into your tea, imagine a Tudor noble snapping off chunks of a sugar loaf with iron nips, grinning through rotting teeth, and proudly thinking, "This pain means I've made it." Imported cinnamon, pepper, cloves and saffron filled Tudor kitchens, with spice cupboards serving as displays of power. Nothing says wealth like food that tastes vaguely like a ship's cargo hold. If Tudor England had a flavour, it wasn't beef, bread, or even ale. It was spice. Not the mild sprinkle of cinnamon you put on your latte, but an avalanche of exotic powders and dried buds that turned Tudor kitchens into aromatic warehouses. To the Tudors, spices weren't just seasonings, they were treasure. They came from distant lands, carried across oceans, bought at staggering cost, and displayed like jewels. A cabinet of spices was less about making food taste good, and more about announcing to your dinner guests, "Yes, I have connections that stretch from here to India. Pass me the pepper grinder." The Tudors weren't growing cinnamon in their back gardens. These spices came from global trade routes. Cinnamon from Sri Lanka, cloves from the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, pepper from India, saffron closer to home, grown in parts of England and Spain, and nutmeg from far-off Banda. Getting them to England involved caravans, sailors, merchants, and more middlemen than you'd want handling your groceries. This made spices mind-bogglingly expensive. A small pouch of pepper might cost a week's wages for a labourer. Saffron, so valuable it was sometimes stored under lock and key, was nicknamed red gold. To sprinkle it into your stew wasn't just culinary choice. It was a public announcement that your bank account was doing very well, thank you. Pepper deserves its own spotlight. Black pepper was the superstar spice of Tudor kitchens. It found its way into nearly every dish, from meats to pottages to sauces. Some cooks seemed to believe that if you couldn't taste the original food under the pepper, you were doing it right. It was the Tudor equivalent of drowning everything in hot sauce. In fact, pepper was so essential that it became a kind of informal currency. Rents and debts could be paid in pepper. Peppercorns were counted as treasure, literally stored in chests alongside silver. Imagine your landlord saying, "Rent is due. Please leave a bag of pepper on the doorstep." That was everyday reality for some Tudor tenants. Cinnamon and cloves brought warmth and exotic sweetness, and Tudors used them liberally in everything from sauces to mulled wines. The result? Many Tudor dishes probably tasted like perpetual holiday cooking. A roasted goose with cinnamon sauce? That was festive cheer with indigestion attached. But cloves, with their sharp medicinal bite, weren't always subtle. Too many cloves and your stew could taste like a dentist's office. Not that Tudors cared. They weren't seeking delicate balance. They were chasing spectacle. The more it smelled like a cargo ship of spices had spilled into your kitchen, the better. Then there was saffron, the king of show-off spices. Just a pinch could turn a dish bright golden yellow, making it glow like edible treasure. Tudor cooks added saffron to breads, pies, soups, and even drinks. Its flavour was delicate, slightly bitter and aromatic, but honestly, it wasn't about the taste, it was about the look. Golden-coloured food screamed extravagance. Saffron was so prized that theft and smuggling were constant problems. In fact, entire towns like Saffron Walden in Essex built reputations on its cultivation. Having saffron in your cupboard meant you weren't just wealthy, you were dazzlingly, ostentatiously wealthy. Tudor cooks rarely used spices sparingly. Instead, they created heady blends that masked the natural flavour of food. Meat sauces were spiced within an inch of their lives. Sweet and savoury were mixed with abandon. Chicken with sugar and cinnamon. Beef with cloves and raisins. Modern chefs would call it fusion. Tudor diners would just call it dinner. The reason? For nobles, food wasn't about tasting the quality of the meat. It was about tasting the reach of their wallets. If a sauce contained pepper, ginger, cinnamon and saffron, it told the guest, "This household can afford more spice in one dish than you'll see in your lifetime." Like sugar, spices weren't just for the table. Tudor doctors prescribed them as medicine. Pepper to warm a cold stomach, cloves to ease toothache, cinnamon for digestion, saffron for melancholy. If you could afford it, your medicine cabinet was indistinguishable from your spice rack. And honestly, some of these ideas weren't entirely wrong. Spices did have antimicrobial and soothing qualities. But Tudors also believed they balanced the humours because, of course, everything came back to humours. If you were sluggish, you needed warming spices. If you were feverish, perhaps fewer cloves in your stew. Dinner was basically a medical consultation served hot. Walk into a Tudor banquet hall, and the aroma would hit you before the sights. Meat roasting on spits, sauces simmering with saffron, pies stuffed with pepper, and jugs of hypocras spiced wine filling the air. It was a sensory flex. Your nose told you how rich the host was before your eyes confirmed it. Poorer households, of course, didn't get this experience. A peasant kitchen might smell of cabbage and onions, maybe a sprig of parsley, if fortune was kind. Pepper and cinnamon? Forget it. To the poor, spices were as remote as the moon. What made spice truly Tudor was its role in theatre. Banquets weren't just about feeding people, they were about dazzling them. Spices transformed ordinary dishes into exotic marvels. A pie dyed golden with saffron, a wine infused with cinnamon, a fish swimming in clove-heavy sauce. It was edible performance art. The irony, many diners probably didn't even like the taste. Spices could overwhelm, confuse, or outright ruin a dish. But in Tudor England, taste was secondary. The point was power. Nothing said wealth like food that tasted vaguely like a ship's cargo hold. Spices in Tudor England were less about flavour and more about symbolism. They linked England to faraway lands, marked the divide between rich and poor, doubled as medicine, and filled banquet halls with heady aromas that shouted prestige. To sprinkle pepper was to declare prosperity. To dye your bread saffron gold was to paint your wealth in edible form. So the next time you grind pepper onto your salad or stir cinnamon into your latte, remember, in Tudor England you'd have just flashed the culinary equivalent of a luxury yacht. Massive pies stuffed with everything from venison to songbirds were the centerpiece of many meals. The crust wasn't to eat, it was medieval Tupperware. When you picture a pie today, you probably imagine a neat little dish with flaky pastry and maybe a scoop of ice cream on the side. In Tudor England, however, pies weren't dessert, they were architectural marvels. These weren't dainty little pastries, they were massive, towering constructions stuffed with meats, fish, or whatever else the cook could cram inside. The Tudors didn't just eat pies, they lived in them, at least metaphorically. And here's the strangest part, the crust. The very thing we fight over today, team crust versus team filling, wasn't meant to be eaten at all. It was called a coffin, a name that didn't exactly make dinner feel cosy, and it functioned like medieval Tupperware. The word coffin in the Tudor sense simply meant a strong pastry case, made of flour, water, and sometimes a little fat. These crusts were tough, dense, and almost rock-hard. They weren't designed for flavour, they were designed for function. A coffin could protect the filling from burning, preserve it for days or weeks, and even transport it if needed. Think of it like shrink-wrapping your venison, except instead of plastic, you had a stone-like pastry that you probably wouldn't want near your molars. After the filling was eaten, the coffin was often discarded, reused as feed for animals, or handed down to servants who might soak it in broth to make it edible. The nobles got the juicy centre, the poor got the stale shell. Dinner hierarchy in crust form. Of course, Tudors never missed an opportunity to turn food into theatre, and pies were the perfect stage. Enormous pies could be baked in elaborate shapes, castles, animals, or coats of arms, and presented at banquets like edible sculptures. Sometimes they weren't just food but surprise boxes. The most infamous example? Surprise pies that contained live birds, musicians, or even small animals that would burst out when the crust was cut open. One banquet reportedly featured a pie that unleashed a flock of songbirds into the hall. Imagine sitting down to dinner, cutting into your meal, and suddenly being dive-bombed by sparrows. Delightful for the audience, perhaps less so for the birds. These were culinary fireworks displays, half entertainment, half meal, and entirely a flex of wealth. The fillings were as varied as Tudor imagination and hunting privileges allowed. Venison pies were among the most prized, but you could also find beef, pork, chicken, rabbit, pigeons, and even eels tucked inside. For nobles, the more exotic the filling, the more impressive the pie. Some even stuffed multiple animals together, creating a Frankenstein's dinner that must have looked like a naturalist's nightmare. One famous Tudor recipe called for a pie filled with birds inside a deer, which was then baked into the pastry shell. It was the food version of Russian nesting dolls, except every doll is edible, and every layer is another cholesterol problem. For everyday folks, pies were humbler but still practical. A small pie filled with whatever scraps of meat or vegetables were available could stretch a meal and preserve it longer. Unlike the giant showstopper pies of noble feasts, these were modest, hearty, and occasionally edible coffins. The coffin crust wasn't just storage, it made pies portable. Travellers, soldiers, and workers could carry a pie in their packs, protected from dirt and weather. The crust locked in the juices, meaning the filling stayed moist for days. In a world without refrigeration, a pie was a lunchbox, fridge, and microwave all rolled into one. Even more practical, pies stacked easily. Cooks could prepare multiple coffins, bake them, and store them for weeks. For households feeding dozens of servants or soldiers, this was the closest thing to meal prep. Not all Tudor pies were savoury, some were sweet, or at least sweet by Tudor standards. Fruit pies, often made with dried fruit, honey, or imported sugar, made appearances at wealthier tables, but even then, the pastry was usually more functional than delicious. The modern idea of a sweet, flaky dessert pie didn't really exist. For Tudors, pies were overwhelmingly about meat, spectacle, and storage. Making a giant coffin pie wasn't for amateurs. It required skill, time, and a well-stoked oven. Pastry needed to be sturdy enough to hold gallons of filling, yet workable enough to mould into elaborate shapes. Cooks in noble households became engineers, building pastry fortresses capable of surviving both the fire and the feast. And the bigger the pie, the bigger the brag. A noble who could present a coffin stuffed with venison, eels, and pheasants wasn't just feeding guests, he was showing off his resources, his staff's skill, and his ability to waste flour on something no one would even eat. Tudor pies weren't just dinner, they were storage systems, entertainment devices, and status symbols rolled into one. The coffin crust protected the filling, while the fillings themselves showcased wealth and imagination. Some pies preserved food for weeks. Others unleashed flocks of birds. Either way, they were unforgettable. So when you next look at your humble apple pie, remember, in Tudor England, the crust wasn't dessert, it was a coffin, and your dinner might have come with a side of pigeons flapping around the chandelier. Lavish feasts featured peacocks, swans, and even porpoises roasted whole for dramatic effect. Dinner came with feathers, scales, and sometimes gilt. If Tudor England had a national sport, it wasn't jousting, it was feasting. Banquets weren't just meals, they were theatres of power, status, and pageantry. Food was not simply eaten, it was staged, dressed, paraded, and applauded. In an age before television, the banquet was the blockbuster event, the place where nobles came to be dazzled, impressed, and occasionally horrified by what landed on the table. Banquets were designed to overwhelm the senses long before you took a bite. Imagine a vast hall decked in tapestries, a roaring fire in the hearth, and trestle tables groaning under silver platters. The noise of minstrels playing, dogs barking for scraps, servants shouting orders, and the clatter of pewter created a soundtrack of organised chaos. And then the dishes arrived, carried in procession. But not just any dishes. These were entire animals, roasted whole, sometimes dressed back in their feathers, scales, or skins for added spectacle. The idea wasn't subtlety, it was shock and awe. Dinner was performance art with claws. Take the peacock, for example. It wasn't enough to roast it. No, Tudor cooks would carefully reattach its shimmering feathers after cooking, so that it was presented to the table in full plumage, like a runway model that happened to be edible. Guests would gape as the bird arrived, looking alive but smelling like a barbecue. Swans got similar treatment. These elegant creatures, once royal property and symbols of prestige, were sometimes roasted and displayed with their necks gracefully arched. Eating swan wasn't just exotic, it was a declaration of aristocracy. Serving it said, "I am wealthy enough to turn a symbol of beauty into leftovers." And then there were porpoises. Yes, marine mammals were on the Tudor menu, though more for spectacle than taste. They were roasted and served at noble feasts, often as a demonstration of exotic abundance. How did they taste? Accounts suggest oily, fishy, and not especially pleasant. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that you had access to something so rare it required specialised fishermen to catch it, and a kitchen willing to cook it. Guests may have applauded the sight while silently wondering if they could discreetly pass their slice to the dogs. Banquets weren't only about roasted animals. Cooks also created subtleties, elaborate edible sculptures made of sugar, marzipan, or pastry. These could be castles, mythological creatures, or scenes from scripture, all painstakingly moulded and painted. They were edible entertainment, often placed between courses to keep guests talking. One banquet might feature a sugar steward George slaying a dragon, another might have a pastry ship sailing across the table. Were they meant to be eaten? Sometimes, but often they were too valuable or too artistic to ruin with teeth. Guests admired them, gossiped about them, and left them as proof of the host's magnificence. Tudor banquets followed strict choreography. Dishes were served in removes, waves of food arriving all at once. A single remove might contain dozens of different dishes, everything from roasted boar's heads to delicate custards. Nobles picked what they pleased, often ignoring half the offerings, while servants and lower-ranked guests scrambled for the rest. The sheer volume of food was staggering. No one expected it all to be eaten. Waste was part of the spectacle. To serve more than could possibly be consumed was the point. It showed abundance, wealth, and generosity, even if most of it ended up scraped into troughs. Banquets weren't silent affairs. Between courses, entertainment filled the gaps. Jugglers, musicians, and dancers performed. Sometimes there were plays or masques, short, dramatic performances that turned the dining hall into a theatre. Guests might pause mid-bite of venison pie to watch acrobats balancing on each other's shoulders, and occasionally the food itself was the entertainment. One famous banquet featured pies that released live birds when cut open, sending feathers and chaos across the hall. Another included a dish of jelly with live frogs inside, hopping across the table to the shrieks of startled diners. It was slapstick comedy with a side of indigestion. Banquets weren't just about food, they were about politics. Where you sat determined your rank. What dish you were served depended on your closeness to the host. Conversation at the high table could make or break alliances. For a courtier, a banquet wasn't dinner, it was an audition, and there were dangers. Offend your host by refusing a dish, and you risked insult. Eat too much too quickly, and you risked ridicule. Drink too heavily, and you might find yourself carried out before dessert. Navigating a Tudor banquet required as much skill as wielding a sword. While nobles revelled in these spectacles, the sheer extravagance carried an undertone of guilt. Outside the hall, peasants survived on pottage and coarse bread. Inside, nobles watched swans in feathered glory arrive at the table. The banquet was a public declaration of inequality, a way of saying, "Look how much we can afford to waste while you starve." And yet the system rolled on, with banquets serving as the ultimate reminder of the social ladder, lavishly feathered at the top, crumb scraping at the bottom. The Tudor banquet was more than a meal. It was a performance, a power play, and a parade of the bizarre. Guests dined on peacocks redressed in feathers, swans roasted in elegance, and porpoises that no one truly wanted to eat. Sugar castles rose from the table, pies burst open with birds, and minstrels filled the smoky hall with noise. So yes, in Tudor England, dinner came with feathers, scales, and sometimes guilt. It was spectacle disguised as supper, where food wasn't just consumed, it was displayed, admired, and remembered. And if you left the table hungry, well, you clearly weren't sitting close enough to the swan. Eggs appeared in sauces, custards, and even drinks, far beyond the breakfast table. For Tudors, eggs weren't just breakfast, they were structural. In Tudor England, the humble egg had a resume longer than a royal banquet menu, while today we mostly think of eggs as breakfast food, fried, scrambled, or boiled. The Tudors had no such narrow view. For them, eggs were a culinary Swiss Army knife, used in sauces, pies, puddings, custards, and even drinks. If it needed thickening, binding, or bulking up, an egg was there, yolk first, ready to get the job done. The egg's biggest strength in Tudor kitchens was its versatility. It bound together meat pies, thickened stews, lightened cakes, and even worked as a glaze to give pastries that golden sheen. Eggs appeared in both sweet and savoury dishes, blurring boundaries that modern eaters take for granted. Tudor cooks didn't stop at scrambled or boiled. They treated eggs as tools, not just food. Need your custard to set? Throw in eggs. Want your pie filling to hold? Eggs. Brewing up a medicinal tonic for a sick noble? Crack an egg in there too, because why not? In a way, eggs were the duct tape of Tudor cuisine. If something fell apart in the kitchen, eggs could probably fix it. Custards were a Tudor favourite, and eggs were the star. These weren't the delicate creme brulees of today, but hearty, sometimes lumpy custards thickened with eggs, flavoured with sugar, if you could afford it, and spiced with cinnamon or nutmeg. Nobles might serve custards in elaborate pastry shells, while peasants made simpler versions with milk, eggs, and maybe a sprinkle of herbs. Bread puddings also leaned heavily on eggs, transforming stale bread into something edible. In a world where nothing went to waste, eggs were the magic that turned leftovers into dessert. Tudor cooks were big on sauces, thick, tangy, spiced concoctions meant to smother roasted meats. And many of these sauces relied on eggs. Beaten eggs were stirred in to thicken gravies or create rich dressings for fish and fowl. One common dish was eggs in sauce, boiled eggs served in a mustard or vinegar-based mixture, sometimes with herbs. For modern diners, this might sound suspiciously like a Tudor experiment gone wrong, but back then it was a perfectly respectable way to serve dinner. One of the strangest Tudor uses for eggs was in beverages. Eggs went into possets, hot-spiced milk drinks curdled with ale or wine, creating something halfway between a drink and a custard. Imagine sipping what feels like alcoholic eggnog but with the texture of lumpy soup. Comforting or disgusting, depends on how much hypocras spiced wine you'd already had. Eggs also appeared in medicinal brews, beaten into mixtures of ale, honey or herbs. These were prescribed for colds, fevers, or just general weakness. So yes, eggs weren't just food, they were health supplements, Tudor style. Tudor cooks weren't shy about combining eggs with protein-heavy dishes. Recipes exist for eggs scrambled with salted fish, baked into pies with minced meat, or even layered into pastries alongside chunks of pork. Eggs weren't relegated to the sidelines, they marched straight into the main course. One particularly eyebrow-raising dish was eel pie, with hard-boiled eggs mixed into the filling, because nothing says bon appetit like biting into slippery eel and suddenly crunching into an egg yolk surprise. Eggs also carried symbolism. They were tied to fertility, rebirth, and Lent traditions. During Easter, decorated eggs sometimes appeared at feasts. At other times, eggs were served whole as a show of abundance. Dozens of hard-boiled eggs piled high on a platter, daring diners to keep count. Even outside of eating, eggs were useful. Egg whites were used in clarifying wine, stiffening pastries, and even in non-food purposes like making glues or medicinal plasters. The Tudor egg really did have a side hustle in almost every industry. Like many foods, access to eggs depended on wealth. Nobles had flocks of hens supplying endless eggs for their kitchens, while poorer families might keep 1 or 2 chickens at most. For peasants, eggs were often saved for special occasions or as a treat, since hens' productivity wasn't as reliable without modern breeding. Still, eggs were more accessible than many luxury foods, making them one of the rare ingredients that crossed social classes. A noble might eat sugared custard studded with saffron, while a ploughman might have a humble boiled egg with bread. Both ate eggs, just not the same way. Tudor physicians, always eager to complicate meals, had plenty to say about eggs. According to humoral theory, eggs were cold and moist if undercooked, but hot and dry if well boiled. Raw eggs were sometimes recommended for throat ailments. Boiled eggs were praised for their strengthening properties, but too many eggs, they warned, could cause windiness or indigestion. In other words, even in the 16th century, people suspected an omelette could leave you regretting your choices. For the Tudors, eggs weren't just breakfast, they were structural. They thickened, bound, decorated, and even cured. They turned stale bread into pudding, eel pies into surprises, and hot wine into curdled comfort drinks. Whether you were a noble licking sugar custard from a golden spoon, or a peasant boiling the only egg your hen produced that week, eggs were essential. So the next time you crack an egg for an omelette, remember, in Tudor England, that same egg might have ended up in a pie coffin, a custard, a medicinal brew, or even floating in your spiced ale. Versatile, indispensable, and occasionally questionable, eggs were the unsung heroes and weird experiments of Tudor cuisine. Cheese varied wildly in quality, and sometimes came crawling with maggots. If your cheese moved on its own, congratulations, it was alive with flavour. Cheese has been around since antiquity, but in Tudor England it was more than a snack, it was a gamble. Every bite was a test of endurance, and quality could swing wildly from rich, creamy wheels to rock-hard lumps better suited for building materials. And sometimes, your cheese didn't just sit on the plate, it wriggled. Unlike sugar and spices, cheese wasn't a luxury reserved for the wealthy. Everyone ate it, from nobles feasting in great halls to peasants crouching by the hearth. It was relatively cheap, easy to make, and provided much-needed protein and fat in a diet heavy on bread and grains. But how it was made, and how long it lasted, determined whether it was a delight or a disaster. For peasants, cheese was often made from goats or sheep's milk, whatever animals could be kept on the margins of farmland. It tended to be hard, salty and aged, until it could survive storage without spoiling. These wheels were practical, portable, durable, and able to keep families fed through lean times. But flavour-wise, let's just say it was less cheddar and more chalk with ambition. The wealthy had access to softer, fresher cheeses, made with cow's milk and sometimes flavoured with herbs or spices. Their kitchens could afford experimentation, producing curds, creams and delicate varieties that peasants never saw. Cheese in a noble household might actually taste good, though it was still risky, because food safety wasn't exactly a Tudor strong suit. Milk spoils quickly, and without refrigeration, cheese was always flirting with disaster. Moulds were common, sometimes edible, sometimes toxic. Cheese mites burrowed into rinds, and if a wheel sat too long, it might become infested with maggots. Now here's the kicker. Not everyone was horrified. Some diners believed maggoty cheese wasn't a problem, it was just extra aged. In parts of Europe, people even developed a taste for it, deliberately allowing flies to lay eggs so the larvae could break down the cheese into a creamy spread. For Tudors, though, this often crossed the line into unfortunate accident. Still, waste not, want not. Many simply scraped the wrigglers away and ate what was left. Appetite is relative when famine is never far behind. So yes, if your cheese moved on its own, congratulations, it was alive with flavour. Cheese also carried subtle class connotations. While nobles enjoyed delicate fresh curds at banquets, peasants' cheese was workmanlike and filling. In fact, some sources suggest nobles occasionally looked down on cheese as peasant food, especially the harder varieties. But when flavoured with sugar, saffron or herbs, cheese could be elevated into courtly fare. Tudor cookbooks even include recipes for cheesecakes made with curds, sugar and butter, a far cry from the tough rounds sold at market stalls. Cheese wasn't only eaten on its own. Tudors used it in pies, pastries and puddings. Recipes exist for cheese baked into tarts with eggs, sweetened with sugar, or paired with herbs. Cheese sauces also appeared, poured over vegetables or meats. It was one of those ingredients that could sneak into multiple courses, sometimes disguised under layers of spice or sugar. At fairs and markets, cheese might be paired with bread for a quick snack, a simple but effective way to survive a long day. Even sailors relied on cheese, packing hard rounds onto ships as durable rations. Of course, after months at sea, those wheels were closer to fossilized artifacts than edible food, but they were filling, if not inspiring. Naturally, Tudor physicians had plenty of opinions about cheese. In humoral theory, cheese was cold and moist, which meant it was risky. Too much of it, they warned, clogged digestion, caused windiness, or even dullness of wit. Translation, eat too much cheese and you'd get gassy and stupid. Some varieties, like fresh soft cheeses, were considered especially dangerous, as they spoiled faster and could upset the stomach. Harder cheeses were seen as safer, but still best eaten in moderation. Physicians sometimes recommended pairing cheese with wine or spices to balance its supposed ill effects. Of course, people ignored the warnings. Cheese was too practical, too filling, and too tasty to abandon, windiness be damned. Cheese was also a local product, tied to regions and traditions. Certain areas became known for producing particularly good or durable cheese, and local markets thrived on the trade. For the Tudors, cheese wasn't yet branded the way modern cheddar or Stilton is today, but the roots of those traditions were forming. Having access to good cheese could set a community apart, while poorer regions made do with tougher, saltier wheels. Despite the risks, cheese remained a staple of hospitality. Offering bread and cheese to a guest was a gesture of welcome, even in humble homes. For nobles, presenting sweetened cheese tarts at banquets showed refinement. For peasants, sharing a wheel of cheese with neighbours cemented bonds. Cheese wasn't just food, it was social glue, sometimes literally, given how sticky old curds could get. Cheese in Tudor England was many things: staple, status symbol, hazard, and hospitality. It ranged from delicate courtly curds to rock-hard peasant rounds, from sugar-laced cheesecakes to maggot-infested wheels. It was beloved, feared, and never fully trusted. So the next time you enjoy a slice of sharp cheddar or creamy brie, remember, in Tudor England you might have been served a writhing block of alive with flavour cheese, and you'd probably have eaten it anyway, Marzipan sculptures, candied fruits, and sugar-coated creations turned dessert into art. Dessert wasn't just eaten, it doubled as interior decoration. When it came to dessert, the Tudors didn't just serve food, they staged edible art exhibitions. The sweet course at a Tudor feast was not a quick pudding to round off a meal, it was a grand finale, a sugary fireworks display designed to dazzle guests and cement the host's reputation as someone with deep pockets and deeper connections to the spice and sugar trade. Sugar itself was a status symbol, as we've seen, but what the Tudors did with it elevated dining into theatre. Tables glittered with candied fruits, frosted nuts, and sculpted marzipan. Instead of a simple pie, nobles might commission entire architectural models carved from almond paste and sugar, painted with edible colours, and displayed as if they were miniature castles. Guests might never actually eat them. They were too expensive, too intricate, and too precious to ruin. Dessert, in other words, wasn't just about taste, it was about spectacle. You weren't simply served sweets, you were served a demonstration of your host's wealth, power, and artistic flair. Marzipan, made from ground almonds and sugar, was the darling of Tudor banquets. It was pliable like clay, which made it perfect for moulding into shapes. Cooks crafted marzipan animals, fruits, coats of arms, even lifelike figurines. Some were painted with bright edible colours to make them look as realistic as possible. Imagine sitting down to dinner and seeing a roast boar on the table, then realising it was actually a marzipan sculpture, complete with tusks. It wasn't food, it was edible sculpture. And when dessert is more talented than you are at art, you know you're living in the Tudor age. Candied fruits were another favourite. Oranges, lemons, and other imported fruits were preserved in sugar syrup, then presented as glittering jewels on silver platters. To serve candied citrus wasn't just to offer a sweet, it was to show that you could afford rare fruits and the sugar to preserve them. That's like driving a Ferrari just to prove you can also afford the gas. Spiced and sugared nuts filled the gaps. Almonds coated in sugar, sometimes dyed in bright colours. They weren't just treats, they were conversation starters, the Tudor equivalent of a party bowl of M&Ms, except each almond represented global trade and a dent in your wallet. Tudor desserts also included subtleties, delicate sugar or marzipan creations placed between courses, as visual and sometimes edible interludes. These might depict mythological scenes, historical battles, or even satirical jokes. A banquet could feature a sugar castle with knights, or a marzipan saint posed in prayer. These weren't desserts in the sense of filling you up. They were edible commentary, conversation pieces meant to keep guests entertained while the next round of meat roasted. In many ways, subtleties were the Tudor PowerPoint slides, flashy visuals that kept the audience engaged, even if they weren't taking notes. Jellies and moulded desserts also appeared, though Tudor versions were thicker and more opaque than our modern gelatin treats. They were often brightly coloured and sometimes gilded with edible gold leaf. Imagine spooning into a shimmering red jelly only to find flecks of real gold floating inside. That wasn't dessert, it was wealth disguised as wobble. Puddings, too, had their sweet incarnations, rice puddings flavoured with cinnamon, egg-thickened milk puddings, and sweet bread puddings with dried fruits. These dishes provided a softer, more comforting end to the sugar extravaganza, though nobles often spiced and sweetened them beyond recognition. Just as with sugar in general, many Tudor physicians insisted sweets were good for you. Candied fruits were thought to aid digestion, spiced wines soothed the stomach, and sugar syrups were used to balance the humours. That meant nobles could gorge themselves on sugary delights while claiming it was all for their health. In practice, of course, these sugary finales probably left more people clutching their bellies than thanking their doctors. But when your custard tart is allegedly medicinal, who's going to argue? It's important to remember that this sugar-soaked spectacle was almost entirely limited to the elite. For peasants, dessert was likely non-existent. Their version of a sweet might be a rare treat of honey or berries, maybe a simple fruit pie if the harvest was good. The glittering marzipan castles and candied oranges of noble tables were as distant to them as the moon. The contrast was stark. While nobles admired sugar sculptures, peasants might never taste refined sugar in their lifetime. The Tudor sweet tooth was thus a symbol of inequality, as much as indulgence. Above all, Tudor desserts blurred the line between food and decor. Tables at banquets became stages of sugar architecture, marzipan artistry, and candied jewels. Guests didn't just eat dessert, they admired it. praised it, and gossiped about it afterward. Sometimes the sweets weren't eaten at all, left instead to harden into dusty relics of a feast long past. So yes, dessert wasn't just eaten, it doubled as interior decoration. In fact, it probably lasted longer as a centerpiece than it did in anyone's stomach. The Tudor sweet tooth wasn't about satisfying hunger, it was about spectacle, status and artistry. Marzipan castles rose on banquet tables, candied fruits sparkled like gems, jellies wobbled with flecks of gold, and sugared nuts kept courtiers talking. Sweets were the final flourish of a feast, proof that your wealth extended beyond meat and bread into the rarefied world of imported luxuries. For most Tudors, sugar was a distant dream, but for nobles, dessert was proof of power, part food, part furniture, and entirely a statement. Next time you see a wedding cake centerpiece, remember, the Tudors would have called that Tuesday. From mustard and vinegar to verjuice and sour concoctions, sauces masked unpleasant flavours. Tudor sauce philosophy. If it smells bad, drown it. The Tudors loved meat, fish and pies, but let's be honest, much of what ended up on the table didn't always taste fresh. Preservation methods, salting, smoking, pickling did the job of keeping food edible, but they also left it dry, tough, or aggressively salty. And let's not forget that refrigeration wasn't an option. That venison haunch might have been hanging in the pantry for weeks, picking up an aroma best described as pre-disaster. The solution? Sauces. Gallons of them. The Tudor kitchen philosophy was simple. If the flavour was questionable, if the smell raised eyebrows, if the texture made you hesitate, just cover it in sauce and carry on. Mustard was the workhorse of the sauce world. Ground from seeds, mixed with vinegar or verjuice, and sometimes spiced, it packed a sharp punch. It was cheap, easy to make, and available to both rich and poor. Peasants might have mustard seeds ground at the local mill, while nobles could afford more refined versions mixed with imported spices. Mustard paired well with fatty meats like beef or pork, cutting through the heaviness. In a way, it was Tudor England's ketchup, a reliable condiment slapped onto anything that needed saving. But while we squeeze ours from a plastic bottle, Tudors spooned it from pots, seeds sometimes still floating inside. If there was one defining Tudor sauce ingredient, it was verjuice, the juice of unripe grapes or crab apples. Tart, sour, and acidic, verjuice was used like vinegar or lemon juices today. It brightened sauces, marinated meats, and cut through overly rich dishes. The brilliance of verjuice was that it was local. England wasn't producing lemons in the 1500s, but crab apples and unripened grapes were plentiful. Every kitchen from manor to cottage could produce verjuice, making it a go-to souring agent. A venison stew too gamey? Add verjuice. A fish pie suspiciously ripe? Verjuice. A sauce that just tasted like brown mush? A splash of verjuice and suddenly you had Tudor haute cuisine. When verjuice wasn't handy, vinegar did the heavy lifting. It flavoured sauces, pickled vegetables, and even acted as a preservative. Some recipes combine vinegar with mustard, garlic or onions, creating blends strong enough to stun your taste buds into ignoring whatever lurked underneath. But for poorer households, vinegar-based sauces were more common than exotic spices. A hunk of salted fish could be softened with vinegar sauce, transforming it from inedible plank to slightly tangy plank. One hallmark of Tudor sauces was their sweet and sour character. Inspired by medieval traditions and influenced by imported spices, Tudor cooks often combined sugar, dried fruits and honey with vinegar, mustard or verjuice. The result was dishes where beef might come swimming in a sauce flavoured with prunes, raisins and cinnamon, all balanced with sour vinegar. To modern palates, this might sound strange, but for Tudors, it was the height of sophistication. Rich and poor alike associated complexity with prestige. The more ingredients in your sauce, the more it showed you could afford. It didn't matter if the end result tasted like Christmas pudding fell into a vat of pickle brine. What mattered was the display. Fish days, those endless fasts, made sauces especially important. A slab of salted herring was hardly exciting on its own, so Tudors doused it in mustard or smothered it in verjuice-based dressings. Some recipes called for almond milk sauces, thickened with breadcrumbs, flavoured with herbs, and sharpened with vinegar. The aim was always the same: hide the fact that the fish had travelled halfway across Europe in a barrel, losing charm with every mile. Tudor cooks worked hard to turn fishy disaster into palatable piety. Like most Tudor foods, sauces reflected class. Nobles could afford complex recipes mixing saffron, sugar, cloves or pepper into their concoctions. Their sauces shimmered golden, smelled exotic, and carried the prestige of imported goods. Peasants, on the other hand, relied on what they could grow or make themselves: mustard, vinegar, verjuice, and herbs like parsley or sage. Their sauces were simpler, but no less important. Even a humble onion sauce could turn a tough, salted bit of pork into something vaguely enjoyable. In the Tudor world, food and medicine blurred constantly, and sauces were no exception. Some were believed to aid digestion, especially after heavy meat courses. Mustard, for example, was praised for warming the stomach, while verjuice was considered balancing for the humours. Doctors often recommended sauces as much as food, arguing that a properly sauced dish was less dangerous than plain roasted meat. In other words, Tudor health advice boiled down to: eat the questionable venison, but don't forget the mustard. It's worth noting that not all sauces were elegant. In many kitchens, especially outside the nobility, sauces could be clumpy, gritty, or overwhelmingly sour. Recipes might involve little more than ground bread, vinegar and onions boiled into a paste. Practical, yes. Tasty? Well, that depends on how desperate you were. Even at noble feasts, guests sometimes complained about sauces being too overpowering, drowning the meat in spice and sourness until the original flavour disappeared. But perhaps that was the point. And devil porcimene? If you couldn't taste the venison, you also couldn't taste that it was 3 weeks past its prime. In Tudor England, sauces weren't an afterthought. They were survival. They covered the sins of preservation, elevated bland food, and turned questionable meats into edible performances. Mustard, vinegar, and verjuice dominated kitchens, joined by the occasional exotic spice for nobles with deeper purses. So yes, the Tudor sauce philosophy was simple: if it smells bad, drown it. And for the Tudors, that was less a joke than a daily reality, because sometimes the only thing standing between you and food poisoning was a ladle of mustard sauce. Raw fruit was deemed unhealthy unless cooked into pies or preserves. An apple a day didn't keep the doctor away, it sent him running. Today we think of fruit as the ultimate health food: colourful, vitamin-packed, the stuff of smoothie bowls and doctor's approval. But in Tudor England, fruit was a medical red flag. Eating raw apples or berries wasn't a sign of health-conscious living, it was practically a cry for help. Physicians, cooks, and ordinary people alike believed that raw fruit could wreak havoc on the body, filling it with dangerous humours and inviting illness straight to your gut. Why the suspicion? Tudor medical theory, rooted in the medieval idea of the 4 humours, warned that raw fruits were cold and moist. This made them dangerous to digestion, which was supposed to rely on a balanced mix of hot, cold, dry and moist. Eat a raw apple, doctors said, and you risked cramps, diarrhea or worse. The logic was simple: if it felt cold and watery going down, it must leave you cold and watery inside. To make matters worse, people often linked outbreaks of disease with fruit harvests. If plague or dysentery arrived in summer, when fruit was abundant, fruit became the scapegoat. A pear wasn't just juicy, it was suspicious. Cooking transformed fruit from suspicious to respectable. Once baked into a pie, stewed in syrup or preserved in sugar, fruit lost its dangerous raw qualities and became safe for the table. This is why so many Tudor recipes for fruit involve cooking it to death. Apples were baked in tarts, plums boiled into preserves, cherries stewed with wine, and pears poached until they could be eaten without offending a physician. The irony is that by cooking fruit until it collapsed, Tudors also cooked out much of the nutritional value. But they weren't chasing vitamins, they were chasing safety. Better a mushy, sugared apple tart than the risk of a raw apple that might send you to bed with the flux, the polite term for explosive stomach trouble. For nobles who could afford sugar, fruit became an opportunity for preservation and display. Oranges and lemons were candied in syrup, turning them into glittering jewels of the banquet table. Cherries, apricots and plums were sealed in jars with sugar, making them last through the winter. This wasn't just about taste, it was about bragging rights. A tray of candied orange peel said, "I can afford to buy fruit from Spain and drown it in imported sugar, just so you can nibble it at the end of dinner." Preserves also made fruit respectable. Once sugar-coated, fruit wasn't raw anymore. It was transformed, purified and allegedly medicinal. Eating candied plums was like popping vitamins. if your vitamins also cost half a year's wages. Imported fruits like oranges and lemons added another layer of glamour. These were expensive, rare, and carried an air of sophistication. Nobles displayed them proudly, sometimes more as decoration than actual food. Recipes called for oranges preserved in syrup or lemon juice added to sauces. But to bite into one raw, that would have been reckless, almost barbaric. Citrus was medicine, garnish or candy, not a handheld snack. In a way, an orange on a Tudor table was like an iPhone on a cafe table today, a status symbol as much as a tool. Apples grew abundantly in England, but they weren't always trusted either. While modern slogans tell us an apple a day keeps the doctor away, a Tudor apple might do the opposite. Physicians warned that raw apples cause stomach aches, loosened bowels, and unbalanced humours. Cooked apples in pies or tarts, perfectly fine. Raw apples from the tree, reckless. One 16th century proverb even said, "Raw apples and pears do harm unto the body." In other words, if you were going to eat fruit, you'd better cook it, or prepare for a swift and unpleasant appointment with the chamber pot. Berries and grapes were no safer. Raspberries, blackberries, and gooseberries grew wild, but people were cautious about eating them straight from the bush. Children sometimes did, of course. Kids have always been less concerned about medical theories, but adults tended to cook berries into jams, wines, or syrups before trusting them. Grapes, when available, were usually turned into wine. Drinking grape juice fresh was considered odd and unsafe. Why drink raw juice when you could ferment it into something healthier? And by healthier, they meant intoxicating and more shelf-stable. Despite all the fear, fruit wasn't entirely banished. It crept into medicine. Physicians sometimes prescribed cooked fruits for constipation, dried figs for digestion, or prunes for gentle relief, but always cautiously, always prepared, and never raw. Fruit was a tool in the doctor's kit, not a casual snack. Peasants probably ate more raw fruit than nobles simply out of necessity. If you had an apple tree in your yard, you weren't going to ignore it because a physician muttered about humours. Hungry families ate what was available, raw or not. For them, fruit was free food, especially in summer, but this only reinforced elite prejudice. Nobles could sniff at fruit as peasant food while peasants kept themselves alive with it. For the Tudors, fruit was a paradox, dangerous when raw, acceptable when cooked, glamorous when candied, and occasionally medicinal. While nobles turned it into sugared jewels of the banquet table, peasants picked it straight from hedgerows with far less concern. So yes, an apple a day didn't keep the doctor away, it sent him running. In Tudor England, fruit was less a health food than a hazard, unless you boiled it, baked it, or drowned it in sugar, and if you dared to bite into a raw pear. Well, don't say the physicians didn't warn you, though your stomach probably did the talking soon enough. Meals involved shared trenchers, hands in communal dishes, and minimal use of forks. Your spoon was optional, but your neighbour's fingers weren't. When you picture a Tudor feast, you might imagine nobles delicately cutting their venison with silver knives, sipping from goblets, and speaking with courtly grace. The truth? Think less Downton Abbey, and more Thanksgiving with too many uncles. Table manners in Tudor England were a work in progress. Etiquette manuals existed, sure, but reality was far messier. Meals were noisy, crowded, communal affairs where good manners often lost out to hunger, hierarchy, and the absence of cutlery. The Tudor equivalent of dinnerware was the trencher. These weren't ceramic plates but thick slabs of stale bread, cut into rounds or squares, used as edible plates. Food was piled onto them, sauces soaked in, and after the meal, the trencher could be eaten, though more often it was tossed to servants or the poor. Imagine eating stew off bread that's been sitting on the table all evening, soaking up grease and sauce, while your neighbour occasionally leans over to scoop something off the same loaf. It wasn't fine dining, it was survival with carbs. And if you were at the low end of the table, you might end up with a trencher so soggy it collapsed before dessert. Forks, the staple of modern dining, were practically non-existent in Tudor England. Knives and spoons did most of the work, but for plenty of dishes, hands were the go-to tool. Diners tore meat from bones, scooped up bites with bread, and dunked fingers into shared sauces. And it wasn't just peasants who did this. Nobles did too. Imagine Henry VIII, greasy-fingered, tearing into a roast bird and wiping his hands on his doublet. Refinement it was not. To be fair, spoons were common, and knives were carried by diners themselves. But forks? Those dainty little tools were seen as suspiciously foreign, overly delicate, and frankly unnecessary. Why bother with prongs when God gave you fingers? Meals were communal, and so were dishes. Food was placed in large platters in the centre of the table, with everyone dipping in. Sharing a dish with a neighbour wasn't optional, it was expected. You might share soup with the person next to you, both plunging spoons into the same bowl. If they had a cold, well, congratulations, you had it too. Etiquette manuals beg diners to show restraint. Don't double dip, don't hog the good pieces, don't dunk your greasy fingers back into the sauce. But human nature being what it is, plenty of Tudors ignored the rules. The result? A dining experience that was equal parts meal and germ exchange. Writers like Erasmus, whose On Civility and Children was widely read, laid out elaborate rules for dining. Don't lick your knife, don't blow your nose into the tablecloth, don't gnaw bones too loudly. These manuals were less about describing how people ate, and more about trying to fix bad habits everyone already had. The very fact these rules had to be written down tells us that plenty of Tudors were happily slurping, gnawing and sneezing their way through supper. Some noble households enforced stricter etiquette, especially at the high table. Courtiers were expected to show restraint, carving neatly, sipping slowly, and leaving scraps for display rather than licking plates clean. But even here, reality intruded. After a few goblets of wine or ale, the line between etiquette and chaos blurred quickly. What about napkins? Well, they existed, but not everyone used them. Many Tudors simply wiped their greasy hands on their sleeves, or worse, on the tablecloth. Dogs often lurked under the table, catching scraps or licking fingers clean when diners thought no one was looking. In some households, it was normal to toss bones to the floor for the dogs mid-meal. Dinner wasn't just shared with your neighbours, it was shared with the family hounds. And yes, manuals again scolded diners for this behaviour. They recommended wiping knives before passing them to neighbours, keeping sleeves clean, and refraining from unsightly spitting. The fact that spitting had to be outlawed tells you everything you need to know. Manners also depended on where you sat. At the high table with the monarch or lord, etiquette was strict. Conversation was formal, and food was carved with ceremony before being served. But further down the hall, things were much looser. Servants and lower-ranking guests ate more quickly, less politely, and with fewer utensils. If the high table was opera, the lower tables were a pub on Friday night. In humble cottages, etiquette was stripped down to necessity. Families gathered around one pot, dipping bread or spoons in, and wiping mouths on the back of their hands. Formal rules mattered less than simply making sure everyone got a fair share. Children were often scolded for grabbing too eagerly, but beyond that, manners were pragmatic. Don't spill the stew, don't let the dog eat it first, and don't poke your sibling with the ladle. Communal eating wasn't just messy, it was unhealthy. Shared trenchers, communal bowls, and finger-licking meant germs spread easily. Outbreaks of illness often swept through households, and dining practices didn't help. But in a world without germ theory, people blamed bad humours or spoiled food, not the neighbour who kept sticking his fingers into the mustard pot. Table manners in Tudor England were a blend of theory and chaos. Manuals preached civility, but reality was trenchers soaked in grease, hands in shared dishes, and sleeves doubling as napkins. Forks were rare, dogs were common dinner companions, and your neighbour's fingers were often closer to your meal than your own. So yes, your spoon was optional, but your neighbour's fingers weren't. Eating wasn't just about food, it was about hierarchy, habit, and holding your stomach strong enough to survive the experience. Common folk dined on pottage, pies and cheap ale sold in bustling taverns. Fast food existed, it was just slower, dirtier and occasionally alive. When we think of Tudor food, it's easy to imagine lords and ladies feasting on swans and sugar castles, but for most people, food was bought, cooked and eaten in far more modest and often grimy settings. Welcome to the world of Tudor street food and taverns, a world of steaming pottage, questionable meat pies, overflowing ale jugs, and vendors who made modern health inspectors faint just by existing. Tudor towns and cities were noisy, crowded and smelly, and food vendors were right in the middle of it all. Market squares and busy streets bustled with sellers offering quick, cheap bites for workers and travellers. The most common offerings? Pies. Not the golden, flaky delights we think of today, but rough, dense pastries stuffed with whatever meat or fish could be found. A pie might contain beef, mutton, or more dubiously, offal and scraps barely fit for cooking. The crust was usually thick and tough, designed more to keep the filling contained than to be enjoyed. You bought it, bit into it, and hoped it wouldn't fight back. Alongside pies came bread, cheese, and the occasional fruit in season. Vendors sold hot chestnuts, roasted meats on skewers, or bowls of pottage, ladled out into whatever container a customer had on hand. Sanitation wasn't the point. Speed and cheapness were. Fast food existed, but it was slower, dirtier, and yes, sometimes still alive if the meat hadn't been cooked thoroughly. For the poorest, pottage remained the staple. Imagine a thin stew made with grains, cabbage, onions, and whatever scraps you could afford or forage. Street sellers sometimes offered bowls of pottage to those who couldn't cook at home, and it was filling if not exactly exciting. Day after day, pottage kept bellies full, if not happy. The line between street food and animal feed was often blurry. The same barley or peas going into your pottage might also be feeding the pigs. If you were unlucky, you and the pigs were probably eating from the same sack. When people had a few pennies more, they headed to taverns, inns, and alehouses. These were the Tudor versions of restaurants, pubs, and motels rolled into one. Each had its specialty. Charles primarily sold wine, catering to wealthier customers. Alehouses sold ale and sometimes food, serving as the watering holes for labourers. Inns provided both food and lodging, important for travellers who needed a meal and a bed. Of the three, alehouses were the beating heart of Tudor communal life. Crowded, smoky and noisy, they offered cheap ale and simple food. Patrons squeezed onto benches, shared trenchers of bread and cheese, and swapped gossip over mugs of small ale. Business deals, local disputes, and the occasional brawl all played out between the walls of these establishments. Step inside a Tudor alehouse and you'd be hit with a sensory storm. The air was thick with smoke from the fire, the smell of spilled ale, and the odour of too many bodies crammed into one room. Dogs lurked under benches waiting for scraps. Dice games rattled in the corners, while someone inevitably sang off-key near the hearth. Food wasn't served with polish. It was hearty, greasy, and plentiful if you had the money. Roasted meats, pies, bread, cheese, and pottage were staples. But presentation, forget it. If your meal arrived in a chipped bowl, lukewarm, and looking suspiciously like last night's leftovers, well, welcome to Tudor dining out. The real draw of taverns and alehouses wasn't just food, it was community. People came to meet neighbours, exchange news and complain about taxes or landlords. For many, it was the only place to relax outside of work. Ale kept conversations lively and tempers short, and more than a few disputes ended with a fight rather than a handshake. Authorities constantly worried about this. Too many people drinking together, they feared, meant rebellion was brewing as much as ale. Regulations tried to limit drinking houses, but demand never faltered. For Tudors, the tavern was as essential as bread. Of course, not every tavern was respectable. Some had reputations for serving watered-down ale or meat that had been hanging a little too long in the pantry. There were complaints about food being bulked out with sawdust or pies filled with mystery meat that was best not identified. If you ordered a beef pie, you had to trust that it wasn't pigeon or worse. Health and safety regulations were loose at best, and customers learned to live with risk. A bellyache after tavern dining was common enough that most shrugged it off as the price of a good evening. Even nobles and wealthy merchants occasionally enjoyed street food. Travellers on the road often relied on inns and roadside vendors for meals. While the food might have been rough, it was convenient, and convenience sometimes trumped refinement. After all, not every noble could haul a kitchen staff along with them on a journey. But for the wealthy, street food wasn't a daily staple, it was a necessity of travel. For the poor, it was survival. That divide was always visible, even in the way food was served. Taverns weren't just about eating and drinking, they often came with entertainment. Travelling musicians, storytellers, and even bear-baiting promoters set up shop nearby. A tavern evening might include dice games, gossip, a lute performance, and a scuffle over who spilled whose ale. Food fueled the chaos, but the atmosphere was the real attraction. Street food and taverns in Tudor England were the true kitchens of the people. They fed labourers rushing through markets, travellers stopping at roadside inns, and entire communities crammed into smoky alehouses. Meals weren't polished, safe, or even always identifiable, but they were filling, communal, and essential. So yes, fast food did exist in Tudor England. It was just slower, dirtier, and occasionally alive, but it was also where people laughed, sang, argued, and lived. For the common folk, taverns weren't just restaurants. They were the heart of Tudor social life, seasoned with a generous helping of ale. Cabbages, leeks, and herbs filled plates when meat was scarce, often dismissed as poor man's fare. Salad wasn't trendy. It was what you ate when you lost the hunt. When you picture a Tudor meal, odds are you imagine steaming joints of beef, golden pies, and sugar-coated extravagance. But lurking at the edge of the platter, often ignored, sometimes resented, were the greens. Cabbages, leeks, onions, spinach, and herbs formed a quieter but essential part of the Tudor diet, especially for those who couldn't afford daily meat. And while nobles turned up their noses at vegetables as peasant fare, the truth is that without these leafy allies, many Tudors wouldn't have survived the lean years. Vegetables were easy to grow, even in small plots or cottage gardens. Families who had no access to deer parks or hunting rights could at least count on their cabbages and leeks to keep them fed. Gardens brimmed with onions, beans, peas, carrots in Tudor England, often purple or yellow, not orange, and turnips. Herbs like parsley, sage, and thyme were planted not only for flavour, but also for their supposed medicinal properties. A peasant household might not boast venison stew, but they could make endless variations of cabbage and leek pottage, cheap, hearty, and available year-round. Vegetables were the survival backbone of the commoner's kitchen. If there was one vegetable that defined Tudor dining for the poor, it was cabbage. It grew easily, could be harvested over long periods, and filled pots with bulk when meat was missing. It could be boiled, stewed, or chopped into pottage with onions and herbs. Was it glamorous? Absolutely not, but it was reliable, and in Tudor England, reliability trumped refinement. Nobles occasionally ate cabbage too, but usually as part of heavily spiced dishes where the vegetable was drowned in sauce. On its own, it was too strongly associated with peasant fare to appear proudly at a high table. Leeks and onions were equally common. They flavoured stews, bulked out pies, and could be grown even in poorer soils. Leeks in particular were a Tudor staple, mild, hearty, and versatile. Garlic was less common in England than on the continent, but still used, often with suspicion for its strong odour. It was more medicine than food in many kitchens, prescribed to treat ailments rather than to season dinner. But onions? Those were everywhere, layered into pies, roasted alongside meats, or boiled in pottage until soft. If you were eating on a budget, you were probably eating onions every day. Raw greens, much like raw fruit, were viewed with suspicion. Physicians warned that uncooked vegetables were dangerous, prone to causing indigestion and imbalance in the humours. Eating raw lettuce or cucumbers was practically asking for a stomachache, they claimed. As a result, salad was not a fashionable starter. It was a risky venture. When greens were served at all, they were usually boiled, stewed, or dressed with vinegar or verjuice to make them safer. Salad wasn't trendy. It was what you ate when you lost the hunt, when meat was scarce and you had to fall back on leaves. Herbs were the bridge between food and medicine. Parsley, thyme, rosemary, and sage-flavoured pottages and meat dishes. But they were also steeped in tonics or poultices. Sage was thought to sharpen memory, parsley to settle the stomach, and rosemary to ward off evil spirits. In Tudor kitchens, herbs went into stews and sauces, not only for taste but also for protection against illness, or at least the belief in it. Wealthier households kept herb gardens not just for seasoning but for show. A noble garden full of neatly arranged rosemary and thyme wasn't just practical, it was a symbol of control over nature, and by extension over health. Though nobles didn't flaunt vegetables, they weren't entirely absent from rich diets. They appeared in pies, soups and side dishes, but almost always heavily disguised. A carrot tart might be flavoured with sugar and saffron. Spinach could be baked into a pastry with cream and eggs. Herbs and greens were rarely allowed to stand on their own. They had to be dressed up to seem worthy of a noble plate. This disdain for vegetables was partly cultural. Meat signalled wealth, hunting rights, and abundance. Vegetables were survival food, reminders of poverty. No noble wanted to be seen chewing on cabbage when a haunch of venison was available. In years of famine, however, vegetables took centre stage whether people liked it or not. Bad harvests, poor weather, or political turmoil could make grain and meat scarce. In these times, pottage thick with cabbages, leeks, and beans became the only thing standing between families and starvation. Vegetables might not have been glamorous, but they were life-saving. Even nobles weren't immune to shortages. They could still eat better than peasants, but when famine struck, even the wealthy tables saw more vegetable stews and fewer roast peacocks. Hunger was the great equalizer, and greens were the fallback plan. Legumes also made up an important part of the Tudor vegetable diet. Peas and beans were grown widely and stored dry for the winter months. They were filling, versatile, and acceptable in both peasant and noble kitchens. Lentils, though less common, also appeared in some recipes. Days provided valuable protein, especially on fish days when meat was forbidden, cooked with onions, herbs, or even bacon for those who could afford it. Peas and beans offered a rare dish that satisfied both bellies and purses. They weren't glamorous, but they were reliable, and reliability was food security. Herbs and greens may have been the forgotten side dish of Tudor dining, but they were indispensable. Cabbages, leeks, onions, peas, and herbs filled plates when meat was scarce, flavoured stews when meat was tough, and kept families alive during lean years. Nobles might sneer at vegetables as poor man's fare, but even their tables made quiet use of them, drowned in sauces, baked in pies, or candied into curiosities. So yes, salad wasn't trendy, it was what you ate when you lost the hunt. Greens might not have carried the glamour of sugar or venison, but without them, Tudor diets would have been even shorter, harsher, and hungrier than they already were. Salting, smoking, and pickling kept food edible but sometimes poisonous. Every bite was a gamble between dinner and dysentery. Without refrigeration, Tudor England had to get creative when it came to keeping food edible. Unfortunately, edible was a flexible term. Preserving meat, fish, and even vegetables was necessary for survival. But the techniques of the day often left food tough, foul-tasting, or downright dangerous. Eating in Tudor times wasn't just about filling your stomach, it was about gambling with your health. The most common method of preservation was salting. Meat and fish were packed in barrels layered with coarse salt until every inch was saturated. This kept rot at bay, but it also turned dinner into something closer to a salt lick than a meal. Imagine biting into beef so salty it puckered your mouth. To make it edible, people soaked salted meat in water for hours, sometimes days, to leach out enough brine to chew without fainting. Even then, the flavour was often overpowering. Salted fish, especially herring, was a staple on fast days, but its texture after weeks in a barrel could best be described as stubborn rubber. And then there was the health risk. Salt slowed decay, but it didn't eliminate it. If the meat was already questionable when salted, the barrel simply disguised the rot. In other words, dinner might look fine until your stomach told you otherwise. Smoking was another key method. Meat and fish were hung in smokehouses or above hearths, absorbing the smoke that deterred bacteria and pests. This worked, but the results were often tough and heavily flavoured with wood smoke. Eating smoked bacon or fish might have felt less like dining and more like chewing a fireplace log. For those who could afford it, smoking added a desirable flavour, but for most, it was about necessity. Smoked foods could last for months if kept dry, but the process wasn't perfect. Smoke didn't always penetrate evenly, leaving some parts preserved and others still vulnerable to spoilage. Pickling was a slightly more reliable method, especially for vegetables. Onions, cucumbers, and cabbages could be preserved in brine or vinegar, giving them sharp, sour flavours that cut through bland diets. Pickled foods also added variety when fresh produce wasn't available in winter. But again, problems lurked. Vinegar had to be strong enough and the seal had to be tight. If not, bacteria thrived. A jar of pickled cabbage might keep you fed through the cold months, or it might send you sprinting to the chamber pot. Preservation wasn't just about survival, it also highlighted class differences. Nobles had the luxury of fresh meat from frequent hunts or livestock slaughtered at will. They didn't rely on salted fish the way peasants did. For the poor, however, preserved foods were a constant. Salted herring, dried peas and pickled onions made up a large chunk of the yearly diet. To eat fresh was a privilege, to eat preserved was a necessity. And while the wealthy complained about the monotony of Lent, the poor lived in a perpetual fast-day menu of salted and pickled fare. Here's the real danger. Preservation wasn't foolproof. Salting, smoking or pickling slowed rot but didn't eliminate it. A poorly packed barrel of fish might turn toxic, a smoked ham might conceal mold deep inside, and pickled vegetables might harbour dangerous bacteria. Food poisoning was common, though poorly understood. Physicians blamed imbalanced humours, corrupt air, or weak stomachs. In reality, many cases were the result of spoiled preserved food. One unlucky bite could mean hours or days of misery. And let's not forget botulism, the hidden threat of improper preservation. Tudors didn't know what it was, but they certainly experienced its effects. For many, every preserved meal was a calculated risk. Even after preservation, storage was tricky. Rats, insects, and damp conditions ruined supplies. Barrels leaked. Pickling jars cracked. Smokehouses invited pests. A year's worth of salted fish could vanish thanks to one bad seal. Households spent enormous effort maintaining food stores, always aware that winter hunger loomed if preservation failed. For peasants, losing a barrel of salted herring could mean starvation. For nobles, it meant humiliation at not being able to feed a household properly. Preservation wasn't just about food safety, it was about survival and status. Oddly enough, some Tudors believed preserved foods were healthier than fresh ones. Salt, vinegar and smoke were thought to stabilize humours and prevent sudden illness caused by fresh raw foods. Physicians sometimes recommended salted meats or pickled vegetables as more reliable than fresh ones, not realizing they were prescribing digestive nightmares. Of course, others cautioned against excess. Too much salted meat, they said, dried out the body and caused kidney stones or heat of the blood. But given the choice between salted beef and starving, most people chose the beef and took their chances. Preserved foods also shaped Tudor culture. Lent menus leaned heavily on salted fish. Winter feasts relied on smoked meats. Even tavern fare often revolved around pickled onions and salted bacon. These foods weren't luxuries, they were cultural touchstones, reminding everyone that survival required planning, labour, and a strong stomach. For Tudor England, preservation was both salvation and hazard. Salting, smoking, and pickling kept bellies full through winter and fasting days, but they came with risks of spoilage, disease, and monotony. Fresh food was a privilege, preserved food was a gamble. So yes, every bite was a gamble between dinner and dysentery. And in a world without refrigeration, that gamble wasn't rare, it was daily life. Tudors sipped hippocranes, mead, and medicinal brews that often defied taste and logic. If it fermented, Tudors drank it, whether or not it should have. Ale may have been the Tudor staple, but it was far from the only thing on the drinks menu. In fact, Tudor drinking culture was a bubbling cauldron of experimentation, improvisation, and occasionally sheer recklessness. From spiced wines to honeyed meads, medicinal tonics to herbal cordials, if it could be brewed, steeped or fermented, someone in Tudor England was pouring it into a jug and calling it a beverage. Taste was optional, effects were the point. One of the most fashionable Tudor drinks was hippocras, a spiced wine popular at noble tables. To make it, wine was mixed with sugar, if you were rich enough to afford it, and a blend of exotic spices like cinnamon, ginger, cloves and pepper. The mixture was then strained through a cloth often called a Hippocrates sleeve after the physician Hippocrates, though he probably never imagined his name would be attached to Tudor happy hour. The result was warming, aromatic, and a little medicinal. It was often served at the end of feasts as a digestive aid, because after eating 6 courses of venison, eel pie and custards, what you really needed was spicy wine to keep everything moving. Hippocras wasn't just a drink, it was considered a health tonic. The Tudors managed to make dessert wine sound like a prescription. Mead, made by fermenting honey with water, was an ancient drink that lingered into Tudor times. Sweet, heavy, and intoxicating, it was both a peasant's comfort and a noble's curiosity. For households that kept bees, mead was a practical way to use excess honey, and it could be flavoured with herbs, spices, or fruits. The problem? Mead could be unpredictable. Depending on how it was brewed, it might turn out pleasantly sweet or aggressively sour. Still, Tudors drank it anyway. As long as it had bubbles and kick, it counted as a success. If you could taste the honey, even better. Beyond leisure drinks, the Tudors had a fondness for liquid medicine that often blurred the line between treatment and torture. Herbal brews were everywhere. Sage steeped in ale for fevers, wormwood wine for digestive troubles, or rosemary cordials for memory. One popular tonic was posset, a mixture of hot milk curdled with ale or wine, sometimes with eggs or spices beaten in. It was prescribed for colds, sleeplessness and general weakness. Imagine being sick in bed and someone hands you a mug of lumpy alcoholic custard. Comforting, maybe. Delicious? Doubtful. Physicians also recommended odd infusions, wine with powdered pearls, ale mixed with ground herbs, or brews involving roots and bark. Many of these tasted vile, but were praised as life-saving. Tudor medicine wasn't about flavour, it was about whether you could swallow without gagging. The Tudor attitude toward fermentation was optimistic. Cider, perry, fermented pears, and fruit wines all made appearances depending on the region. Farmers pressed whatever fruit they had, left it to ferment, and drank the result. Did it taste good? Not always, but if it made you lightheaded, it was working. In towns, small beer, a weak ale with low alcohol, was the daily drink for children and labourers. But for those looking for more excitement, stronger brews, wines, and spiced concoctions filled the gap. The line between refreshment and experiment gone wrong was thin, but Tudors rarely let that stop them. Wealthier Tudors had access to imported wines from France, Spain, and even the Mediterranean. Claret, sack, a fortified wine from Spain, later beloved by Shakespeare, and Malmsey, a sweet Greek wine, all graced noble tables, but imported wine was costly and often arrived spoiled after long voyages. Spices, sugar, and honey weren't just for flavour, they covered up the fact that the wine had gone off. Still, sipping foreign wine was a status move. To serve sack at a feast was to say, I can afford to drink the Mediterranean, even if it tastes like vinegar. Nobles weren't drinking for subtlety, they were drinking for prestige. In taverns and alehouses, drinks could get even stranger. Some landlords brewed house specialties that stretched ingredients further than honesty allowed. Ale watered down to the point of invisibility. Mead mixed with dubious herbs and wines cut with vinegar were common complaints. Customers didn't always know what they were getting until the first sip or until the stomach pains began later that evening. Still, taverns thrived, because the point wasn't the drink, it was the company, the warmth and the noise. Even a dubious brew was better than sitting home cold and sober. Like food, drinks carried symbolic weight. Spiced wine was thought to warm the humours. Honey mead was associated with fertility, hence the term honeymoon. And herbal cordials were practically liquid charms. A drink could be medicine, magic, or merriment. Sometimes all at once, but superstition cut both ways. Some believed certain drinks caused melancholy, sluggishness, or dangerous heat in the body. Moderation was encouraged in theory, though judging by tavern brawls, practice was another story. For most Tudors, odd drinks were occasional luxuries. Ale remained the backbone of daily life, with water too risky and wine too expensive. But when the chance arose, whether at a feast, a tavern, or a sickbed, people eagerly tried hypocries, mead, or herbal concoctions. Even if they didn't always taste good, they carried novelty, prestige, or hope for health. Tudor drinking culture went far beyond ale. From spiced hippocras to honey mead, from medicinal possets to experimental fruit wines, the Tudors lived by one rule: if it fermented, drink it, whether or not it should have. Some drinks were delicious, others dangerous, and many downright bizarre, but each carried with it the spirit of Tudor ingenuity, turning whatever nature or alchemy provided into something that could fill a cup, start a conversation, or at least give you something to complain about the next morning. Lavish banquets displayed power and hierarchy, with seating arrangements as political statements. Your seating position was less about comfort and more about survival. In Tudor England, banquets weren't just about food, they were about politics. Every roast swan, every gilded pie, every goblet of hippocras carried meaning beyond taste. A feast was a stage on which power was performed, alliances were tested, and status was broadcast in edible form. To be invited was an honour. To be seated was a statement. In the Tudor world, dining was diplomacy served with sauce. The high table, the throne of dinner. At the centre of this political theatre was the high table, usually raised on a dais so everyone could see who mattered most. Here sat the monarch, nobles of highest rank, and guests of honour. The closer you were to the monarch, the greater your prestige. Sitting at the end of the hall was less an insult than a reminder of your place in the pecking order. To dine beside Henry VIII, for instance, wasn't just a meal, it was a survival strategy. Being close meant visibility, influence, and the chance to whisper in royal ears between mouthfuls of venison. Being too far away meant being forgotten, and in Tudor politics, being forgotten was often the first step to being replaced. Seating arrangements were carefully calculated. Courtiers schemed for positions, knowing that proximity to power meant everything. A seat 2 places closer could mean a promotion, a marriage alliance, or royal favour. Conversely, being shuffled down the table signalled a fall from grace. Even the order of service reinforced status. The choicest dishes, venison, swan, spiced pies, were presented first to the high table. By the time platters reached the lower ranks, only scraps might remain. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was a visible hierarchy of privilege. Royal banquets were public performances. Nobles, ambassadors, and foreign dignitaries were often invited not to enjoy the food, but to witness Tudor wealth and power in action. The sheer scale of dishes, hundreds of them sometimes, was designed to intimidate as much as impress. A visiting ambassador might sit down to roasted peacocks in full feather, sugar sculptures, and fountains of spiced wine. The message was clear: England is wealthy, powerful, and capable of drowning you in pudding if necessary. The food was often less important than the spectacle. What mattered was the impression, the gossip carried back to foreign courts, and the subtle, or not so subtle reminder that Tudor monarchs ruled not only with armies but with feasts. The ritual of service. The way food was served also displayed hierarchy. Carving was a ritualized performance, often done by trained carvers who demonstrated skill and grace as they sliced meat before the high table. Platters were carried in procession, with servants bowing low, emphasizing that every dish was a gift from the monarch's bounty. Even the act of passing a dish was political. You didn't serve yourself. You received what the servers offered, in the order dictated by rank. If you got a slice of peacock breast rather than a wing, that said something about your standing. Every bite carried meaning. Diplomacy at the table. Feasts were fertile ground for alliances and negotiations. Marriage arrangements, treaties, and favours were discussed over trenchers of meat. A shared cup of wine could cement trust, while a refusal to eat might be read as insult. Ambassadors studied every detail: how much food was offered, where they were seated, whether they received delicacies or common fare. To a foreign dignitary, a Tudor banquet wasn't dinner, it was intelligence gathering. Dangers of the feast, but banquets carried risks too. With so many eyes watching, one misstep could spell disaster. Eating too greedily, speaking out of turn, or failing to observe etiquette could tarnish reputations. A spilled goblet, a drunken slip of the tongue, or a poorly timed jest might undo years of careful political manoeuvring. There was also the danger of deliberate exclusion. Not receiving an invitation to a feast or being seated far from the action was a clear political message. In Tudor England, silence at the table often spoke louder than words. The role of the audience. Banquets weren't private affairs. Servants, musicians, and sometimes even members of the public watched from the sidelines. These onlookers saw who was favoured, who received the best dishes, and who was ignored. Feasting was a display meant to be seen and gossiped about. Rumours spread from dining hall to street corner, carrying political weight far beyond the table. Beyond the court, even outside the royal court, feasts were political. Wealthy landowners used them to cement ties with tenants. Bishops used them to display church authority, and guilds staged them to show prosperity. A banquet was never just a meal, it was a message. I have enough food to share and enough power to decide who shares it with me. Tudor feasting was politics served on a platter. Seating arrangements mapped out the hierarchy. Dishes were distributed by rank, and every gesture carried meaning. To eat at the high table was to bask in favour. To sit at the far end was to risk obscurity. So yes, your seating position was less about comfort and more about survival. In a world where political fortunes rose and fell with the monarch's mood, a place at the feast could be your ticket to power, or a signal that you'd soon be dining alone. Strict hunting regulations and counterfeit delicacies shaped what people ate. If you couldn't afford venison, you settled for mystery meat with ambition. In Tudor England, the dinner table wasn't just shaped by appetite or availability, it was policed by law and padded by fakery. From the king's forests to the marketplace stalls, rules dictated who could eat what, while creative cooks and cheeky vendors found ways to make fake versions of the delicacies they couldn't afford. To eat in Tudor England was to navigate a maze of restrictions and illusions. Let's start with venison. It wasn't just a tasty meal, it was political property. Deer in royal forests belonged to the crown, and hunting them was strictly controlled. Only nobles with permission could legally chase deer or boar. For peasants, being caught poaching was no small matter. Punishments ranged from fines and prison to mutilation, or even execution if you killed a royal deer. But hunger has always been stronger than law. Poaching was rampant. A hungry family might risk everything for a haunch of venison, sneaking into the forest at night with snares. Some poachers became local heroes, Robin Hood-style figures who thumbed their noses at noble privilege. Still, most ordinary folk never saw venison on their plates unless it trickled down as leftovers from noble feasts. So, if you couldn't afford venison, you made do with something else. Fake venison and counterfeit feasts. One of the cleverest Tudor culinary tricks was fake venison. Recipes existed to transform cheaper meats into imposters. Cooks soaked beef, pork, or even mutton in wine, spices and sometimes animal blood to mimic the rich, gamey flavour of deer. The results weren't perfect, but they gave the illusion of luxury to households that couldn't legally or financially serve the real thing. And it wasn't just venison. Tudor cooks had recipes for mock versions of all kinds of foods. Mock goose, made from seasoned pork. Mock fish, sometimes crafted from almonds on fasting days. And even mock eggs, sugar or almond paste moulded and dyed to look like yolks and whites. To modern ears, this sounds like a medieval version of plant-based substitutes, except instead of soy burgers, you got pork pretending to be goose. Bread frauds and dodgy bakers, food fakery wasn't limited to the kitchen, it flourished in the marketplace too. Bread, the Tudor staple, was tightly regulated by the assize of bread and ale, a law that dictated its weight, price and ingredients. Bakers caught cheating by adding chalk, sand or powdered beans to stretch their flour faced harsh punishments, including public humiliation. A dishonest baker might be dragged through the streets with bad loaves hung around his neck, but the risk didn't always stop them. Flour was expensive, famine was common, and desperate bakers found ways to cut corners. For the poor, every loaf was a gamble. Would it be nourishing, or would it chip your teeth? Fishy substitutes. Religious fasting days created another breeding ground for fake foods. With meat banned for dozens of days each year, demand for fish skyrocketed. Not everyone could afford fresh fish, so vendors sold salted, dried or pickled substitutes, and sometimes outright frauds. Catfish might be passed off as sturgeon, or cheap freshwater fish disguised as pricier varieties. Some cooks even created mock fish from almonds or eggs, shaping them into fish-like forms for fasting tables. These weren't just practical, they were entertaining. Imagine biting into what looked like a fried herring, only to discover it was almond paste. The black market of food. Of course, whenever laws restricted food, black markets thrived. Smugglers sold venison, wild birds and other forbidden delicacies under the table. Illegal feasts weren't uncommon, where nobles or wealthy merchants winked at regulations and served poached game anyway. For the poor, counterfeit foods were more common. Fake venison pies, watered ale, and mystery meats that no one wanted to examine too closely. If it tasted vaguely like the real thing, it passed. Ambition was half the flavour. Food laws as control. Food laws weren't just about safety, they were about control. By regulating who could hunt, bake, or sell, the crown reinforced hierarchy. Nobles kept their privileges, bakers and brewers were kept in check. Peasants were reminded of their place every time they ate salted herring instead of venison pie. Even sumptuary laws, rules about who could wear what fabrics or eat certain foods, were a way to draw visible lines between classes. The Tudor dinner table was a constant reminder that you were what you ate, and more importantly, you were what you were allowed to eat, the taste of deception. For the common folk, fake foods weren't embarrassing, they were survival. You didn't apologise for serving mock venison, you congratulated yourself on stretching a cheap cut into something that tasted rich. Food deception became a kind of culinary creativity, a Tudor version of fake it till you make it. At the same time, fakery could backfire. Mystery meat pies, watered wine and adulterated bread carried real dangers. What was meant to stretch supplies often made people sick. In a society where food was already precarious, fake foods added another layer of risk. Food laws and fake foods defined Tudor diets as much as bread or ale. Strict regulations kept venison and game out of common hands, while counterfeit delicacies filled the gap. Bakers cut flour with chalk, cooks transformed pork into goose, and vendors passed off whatever they could to hungry buyers. So yes, if you couldn't afford venison, you settled for mystery meat with ambition. In Tudor England, survival required compromise, creativity, and occasionally turning a blind eye to what was really on your plate. Poor harvests and grain shortages meant starvation loomed over many lives. The Tudor diet wasn't always weird, it was sometimes non-existent. For all the spectacle of sugar castles, venison feasts and peacock pies, the reality for much of Tudor England was far bleaker. Food wasn't just about taste or variety, it was about survival. The Tudor diet could vanish overnight if the harvest failed, if grain supplies faltered, or if prices skyrocketed beyond the reach of ordinary people. For the poor, hunger wasn't an occasional discomfort, it was a lurking shadow, waiting each year to see if the crops would grow or the cupboards would stay bare. The fragility of the harvest. Tudor diets depended heavily on grain, wheat for bread if you were wealthy, rye, barley or maslin, a wheat and rye mix if you were poor. This reliance made society frighteningly vulnerable. A single bad harvest, whether from drought, floods or disease, could tip entire regions into crisis. With little ability to import food in bulk, communities were at the mercy of the weather and the soil. When grain yields failed, prices spiked. Records show that in bad years the cost of bread doubled or even tripled. For nobles, that meant grumbling over higher expenses. For peasants, it meant starvation. If you already lived on the edge, one bad harvest could push you over. The cycle of scarcity. Famines tended to follow a cruel rhythm. Summer promised hope as crops grew, but if rains failed or blight set in, shortages appeared in autumn. By winter, stores were low, and by spring, the hungry gap, things were dire. Fresh food wouldn't arrive until the next harvest, and families clung to dwindling supplies of stale bread, salted fish, or whatever wild greens they could scavenge. This hungry gap became infamous. People grew gaunt, weak, and desperate. Theft rose, and disease often followed, since weakened bodies were more vulnerable. Hunger wasn't just an inconvenience, it was the difference between life and death. Starvation at the margins. For peasants, famine was devastating. Families stretched pottage thinner, cut bread with filler, bran, peas, even ground up acorns, and foraged for edible plants. Stories circulated of people eating grass or bark in desperation. These were not exaggerations. Archaeological evidence and chronicles suggest that during the worst shortages, people truly turned to whatever they could chew to keep going. Even in towns, life was precarious. Poorer households without land to grow their own food relied entirely on markets. When prices soared, they had no safety net. Hunger riots broke out in cities when bakers were accused of hoarding grain or selling it unfairly. Tudor monarchs knew hunger could destabilize their rule. Grain shortages often led to unrest, riots, and rebellions. To prevent disaster, governments tried to regulate food supplies. Laws against hoarding were enacted, and assizes, price controls on bread and ale, were enforced more strictly during bad years. Still, these measures were only partially effective. Wealthier merchants often found ways to profit from scarcity, buying up grain and reselling at inflated prices. For ordinary people, laws did little to fill empty stomachs. Nobles and the cushion of privilege. While peasants starved, nobles rarely faced true famine. Their estates gave them access to grain, livestock, and game. They might suffer inconvenience, fewer imported luxuries, leaner feasts, but they didn't face the gnawing hunger that plagued the poor. Still, nobles worried about famine too, not for themselves but for the threat of rebellion. A starving peasantry was a dangerous one. In this way, famine shaped politics. Feeding the poor wasn't always charity, it was strategy, a way to prevent riots and keep order. Religious explanations. Hunger wasn't just seen as a natural problem. Many Tudors interpreted famine as divine punishment, evidence of God's displeasure with the nation. Poor harvests were blamed on sin, moral decay, or witchcraft. Fast days and processions of prayer were held to beg for relief. This spiritual framing didn't put food on the table, but it gave meaning to suffering. For some, famine was God's way of testing faith. For others, it was a reminder of society's sins. Either way, people had to find comfort in explanations while their stomachs remained empty. The psychological weight of hunger. Hunger wasn't only physical, it was psychological. For families constantly balancing survival, the fear of famine loomed even in good years. Parents worried whether their children would survive the winter, whether the next harvest would be kind. whether they could pay for bread if prices rose again. Hunger shaped mental as well as physical lives, pressing people into a constant state of anxiety. Small comforts in desperation. In desperate times, people turned to community. Neighbours shared what they could. Monasteries before the dissolution offered alms and food, and local lords sometimes distributed grain to prevent unrest. Taverns, even in bad times, could offer small ale and pottage, though often watered down. But these comforts were fragile. Once supplies truly ran out, even generosity couldn't stretch the food further. Hunger had no patience for charity. For all the flamboyant excess of Tudor feasting, famine haunted daily life. Bad harvests, high grain prices and the dreaded hungry gap made starvation a constant threat for the majority of the population. Nobles could distract themselves with sugar subtleties and swan roasts, but for peasants the Tudor diet wasn't always weird. It was sometimes non-existent. So yes, dining in Tudor England was always a gamble. One year you might see abundance, the next you might be scouring hedgerows for weeds. In a world where survival depended on weather, politics and luck, the line between a feast and famine was as thin as a stale slice of bread. Tudor culinary traditions left lasting marks on English cuisine. We don't eat swan pies anymore, but tea and ale stuck around. Thankfully not at the same time. When we look back at Tudor food, it's easy to focus on the weirdness. The maggoty cheese, the eel pies, the peacock redressed in feathers. But beneath the spectacle and strangeness, Tudor dining shaped the foundations of English cuisine for centuries to come. The Tudors didn't just eat, they experimented, codified and set patterns that outlasted them, weaving their culinary habits into the DNA of what we think of today as British food. The end of medieval, the beginning of modern. The Tudor period was a transitional era for English cooking. It stood between the spiced-heavy medieval palate and the more restrained, ingredient-focused cuisine of later centuries. The Tudors inherited medieval tastes for sugar and spice overload, where beef came with raisins and pies came gilded with saffron. But they also began simplifying dishes, gradually moving toward plainer roasts, puddings and breads that resemble modern meals more closely. This in-between stage explains why Tudor recipes can feel both bizarre and familiar. Roast beef? That's recognisably English. Roast beef with prunes and cinnamon in vinegar sauce? That's Tudor flair halfway between the Middle Ages and a Sunday roast. Ale, the lasting legacy of liquid bread. Ale was the daily drink of Tudors, and it remained central to English life for centuries after. While today we have lager and craft beer, the idea of ale as the safe everyday beverage began here. Brewing ale became a household craft, then a commercial enterprise, and eventually an industry. From Tudor, alehouses grew the pub culture that is still a cornerstone of British social life. And though Tudor children guzzled weak ale instead of juice boxes, the tradition of beer as daily bread echoes even now in the cultural pride around pints. The Tudors may not have had IPA flights, but they'd recognise the ritual of gathering over a mug. From spices to simplicity, one of the biggest Tudor legacies was how they treated spices. In the early 1500s, nobles flaunted their wealth by drowning dishes in cinnamon, cloves and pepper. But as trade expanded and spices became more accessible, their shock value faded. By the late Tudor era, there was a slow shift toward valuing the natural flavour of meats and vegetables, a trend that grew in later centuries. In short, the Tudors helped set the stage for the English roast tradition. Without them, the Sunday roast might still be a cinnamon and saffron experiment rather than the simple hearty meal it became. Pies and pastry power. If the Tudors were obsessed with one food form, it was pies. Meat pies, eel pies, fruit pies. They stuffed anything into pastry coffins. While the medieval coffin crusts were inedible, Tudor cooks began refining pastry into something worth eating. By the Elizabethan era, pastry making was an art, and the pie had cemented itself as a national dish. Today, the British meat pie, Cornish pasty, and even the humble apple pie all trace lineage back to Tudor kitchens. We may not bake live birds into them anymore, but the Tudor love of encasing food in pastry never went away. Sweet tooth, sweet future. The Tudors also bequeathed England its sugar obsession. What started as a noble luxury, sugar subtleties, candied fruits and marzipan sculptures trickled down to wider society over the centuries. By the 17th and 18th centuries, England had one of the fiercest sweet teeth in Europe, paving the way for tea with sugar, biscuits, puddings and cakes. So when you stir sugar into your tea, thank the Tudors. They didn't invent the ritual, but they made sugar central to elite dining, ensuring that future generations couldn't imagine a day without something sweet. Table manners evolve, finally. Tudor dining also nudged England toward more refined table manners, though slowly. Forks were still rare, sleeves still doubled as napkins, and communal trenchers remained standard. But the constant production of etiquette manuals during the period set expectations for the future. By the time forks finally became common in the 17th century, the groundwork for proper table manners had been laid. The Tudors began the shift from eat with your hands and hope toward a dining culture that prized civility, hierarchy, and display. Our modern dinner tables, with their utensils and seating rules, owe more than a little to those messy Tudor feasts. What disappeared? Not every Tudor tradition survived, of course. You'd be hard-pressed today to find a roast swan in a London restaurant, or to see eel pies gracing banquet tables. Porpoise roasts disappeared quickly, likely to universal relief, and maggot-infested cheese thankfully didn't become a national export. These foods faded not only because tastes changed, but because the symbolism behind them died with the age of royal spectacle. Swans were less about flavour and more about power. Once that mattered less, they vanished from menus. Global beginnings. Tudor dining also marked the beginning of England's global food connections. Imports like citrus, sugar and spices signalled early globalisation, even if only nobles could afford them. These trade networks expanded massively after the Tudors, but the seeds were sown here. The idea that English tables could include foods from across the world, be it sugar from the Caribbean or oranges from Spain, was already taking root. The cultural memory of hunger, equally important, seeing was the darker legacy of hunger. Famines and grain shortages reminded everyone of food's fragility. This anxiety shaped laws, markets, and even traditions of charity. The memory of going hungry lingered, influencing how future generations stored food, regulated grain, and approached preservation. Even the hearty, simple comfort foods of England, stews, puddings, bread with cheese, owe their existence to a culture that never forgot scarcity.